The Quiet Mysteries of Pokémon, a long walk through the things never fully explained. There are places inside Pokémon games where the answer was never written, where a door opens onto a single strange line of description and then closes again without further comment. For nearly 30 years now, players have wandered into small stone rooms, paused before half-finished stories, and pressed against walls that seem to hint at more behind them. These quiet, unfinished puzzles have followed the series from region to region, drifting just beneath the surface of every adventure. They are the mysteries the games never quite resolved, the questions left sitting at the edge of the path while the main story moves on. Some of them are tied to ancient ruins, others to ordinary houses on ordinary routes, and a few of them appear in only a single sentence spoken by a child who never appears again. And before we drift any deeper into this gentle territory, leave a like if you find a small calm in these slow walks through the strange corners of the series, and tell me what time of night it is wherever you happen to be watching from. The first of these mysteries waits in a quiet stone building on the eastern edge of Kanto, in a town where the air has always felt a little different from the rest of the region. Lavender Town in the original Kanto games is a place that visitors describe as muted, almost faded, a small settlement built around a tall tower where families come to lay their Pokémon to rest. The tower itself is something between a graveyard and a temple, with each floor occupied by mourners, mediums, and the occasional figure who has lingered longer than seems entirely natural. When a player first steps inside, the music shifts into something thinner and quieter than the rest of the soundtrack, and the encounters that follow begin to feel less like battles and more like interruptions of something private. On one of the middle floors, a shadow appears that cannot be identified at first. It cannot be caught, it cannot be examined with the standard tools, and it can only be seen clearly after the player has obtained a particular device from a particular character several routes away. When that device is finally used, the shadow resolves into the silhouette of a Marowak, and a brief description appears explaining that this is the spirit of a mother defending her child from people who came up the stairs to take something that did not belong to them. The exact details around this ghost are sketched lightly. We know that a group of unwelcome visitors entered the tower at some point in the recent past, that one of their actions led directly to a Marowak's death, and that the mother's spirit refused to leave the place where it fell. After the battle ends, the ghost passes on quietly, and the floor becomes silent again. No further mention of the event is ever made, and the player simply walks down the stairs and returns to the rest of the journey. What gives this small moment its strange weight is how rare it is for a Pokémon game to acknowledge death so directly. The series has always been gentle about the boundaries between life and rest, choosing softer words and softer images whenever the subject comes near. The ghost of the Marowak is one of the few times where the games allow a player to stand directly in front of the question, and the way it lingers in memory has shaped how generations of players think about ghost-type Pokémon ever since. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the small bone-carrying creature that walks the floors below the tower's middle landing. The Cubone Pokédex entry, written across many generations, returns again and again to the same painful theme. The skull it wears is described as belonging to its mother. The cry it makes is described as a sound of mourning, and the patterns of its tears are said to be visible on the surface of the bone itself when the moon is full. When a player connects these descriptions to the events on the upper floors of Pokémon Tower, a quiet picture begins to form. The Marowak ghost is a mother who died protecting her child, and the Cubone who wander the lower halls and the surrounding routes are children carrying the only thing they have left. The series never says this directly, never draws an explicit line between the two, but the pieces fit together so cleanly that the connection has become part of how players understand both Pokémon. There is something deeply careful about the way this story is told. No one in the games sits the player down to explain it. No cutscene plays out to make the meaning obvious, and no character delivers a speech that ties the threads together. Instead, the meaning forms slowly in the player's own mind as they walk between two floors of a single tower and read a few sentences in a Pokédex they may not even open very often. This is one of the earliest examples of a recurring pattern in Pokémon mysteries. The games rarely tell you the answer outright. They scatter small details across regions, across generations, across optional text and side characters, and they trust that the player will eventually notice the shape of the larger picture. The Cubone and the Marowak ghost are not solved by exploration so much as recognized, the way a person might suddenly understand a poem they have read many times before. Far to the south of Kanto, in a place that no road on the map connects to anything, there is a small island reachable only through a single special event that occurred in a specific year on specific dates. Faraway Island appears on no in-game map, has no harbor that the standard ferries visit, and exists only because a particular item, once distributed at official events, allowed the player's boat to take an unusual course through the waves. What waits on that island is a small forested clearing where a single Pokémon moves between the trees, almost playful, almost shy, and almost impossible to catch. The Pokémon waiting in that clearing is Mew, and the official lore around its origins has always emphasized the same setting. Mew is said to have been discovered deep in a jungle in a region resembling South America, sometimes referred to as the Jungle of Guyana, sometimes described more generally as a forest no ordinary expedition could reach. The implication has always been that Mew predates the categorization of Pokémon, that it existed before the regions had their names, and that any time it appears, it does so in a place still untouched by the wider human world. Faraway Island is the closest the games have ever come to showing that jungle directly. It is small and quiet and overgrown, with no buildings, no trainers, no shops, and no music beyond the soft ambience of leaves. The player walks through it slowly, and Mew darts away into the grass each time it is approached, hiding for a few seconds before reappearing somewhere else nearby. There is no battle music at first, no announcement that something rare is happening, and no fanfare when Mew finally allows itself to be encountered. The whole sequence feels less like a game event and more like a careful private meeting, and the island itself feels less like a place than like a small held breath. When the encounter ends and the player leaves the island, the way back closes again, and the path can never quite be retraced through ordinary means. What makes the Faraway Island mystery so resonant is how it gestures at something larger than itself. There is the suggestion that Mew might still be out there in some quiet, untouched place, and there is the suggestion that the world of Pokémon contains more space than the maps actually show. Every region we visit is a piece of the whole, but the whole is wider than any single game has ever drawn it. Beneath Pokémon Tower, under the stone foundations of Lavender Town, there is something that has never been explained, but has been suggested in several careful ways. The town stands above the tower, and the tower stands above the resting places of countless Pokémon, and the resting places have been there for as long as anyone in the games can remember. In the remake of the original Kanto adventure, a brief line of dialogue mentions that the tower was originally built to house something specific, and that the something has not always behaved as gently as it does now. The remake introduces a quiet rumor about a great rainbow-colored Pokémon that once perched on the tower's roof, and the suggestions is that the tower was built either to honor that creature or to mark the place where it once descended. The rainbow Pokémon is, of course, the same creature that appears in distant towers in other regions, and the implication is that Kanto, too, may once have been touched by its rare and quiet visits. The exact reason it stopped coming is left undescribed, though some players have connected it to a separate tower that burned in another region. The graves below the tower are not all visible to the player. There are floors that the camera never quite reaches, and there are sections where the textures change slightly, as if to suggest that the structure continues underground in directions the player can never visit. The mystery is not whether there is something below. The mystery is what exactly is being kept down there, and whether the tower is more of a monument or more of a seal. When players grow up enough to revisit these early games with adult eyes, the tower often becomes one of the first places they remember as having felt strange. The music, the encounters, the ghost on the middle floor, the implications of the surrounding Pokédex entries, all of these combine into a single atmosphere that the rest of the game never quite repeats. Whatever was happening in the tower, the developers chose to leave it half-spoken, and that half-spokenness has stayed with the series ever since. Hidden behind a small route in the eastern Hun region, accessible only through a side path that many players walk past without noticing, there is a Pokémon called Spiritomb. The Pokédex entry that accompanies it explains that Spiritomb is made up of 108 spirits, all bound together inside a stone keystone, and the binding itself is described as a punishment for a series of misdeeds that occurred long ago. The exact misdeeds are never specified, the exact century is never given, and the exact name of the keystone's original owner is never recorded. To meet Spiritomb in the wild, a player must perform a small ritual of their own. They must walk a specific path through the underground network, exchange greetings with 32 other players, or in some versions 32 other ghosts, and then return to the keystone with their tally complete. Only then does Spiritomb appear, and even then, the encounter is brief, and the explanation remains short. The number 108 is not arbitrary. It draws from older traditions in Japanese culture and Buddhism, where the number is said to represent the worldly desires that bind a soul, or the bells that are rung at the end of the year to release those bindings. The choice to attach this number to a single Pokémon is one of the more direct cultural references the series has ever made, and it sits beside the other ghost-type Pokémon in the regional roster with a weight that feels heavier than most. What the games never tell us is who the original sinner was. We are told that the spirits were bound together as a consequence, but we are not told whether they were guilty of the same act, whether they shared a single common crime, or whether they simply happened to be near the keystone at the moment of the sealing. The Pokémon exists, the rule is described, and the rest is left for the player to imagine. Spiritomb's design carries this ambiguity into its appearance. The face is a single expression made up of many smaller faces. The body has no clear shape, and the keystone always sits beside it as a reminder of the binding. When it battles, the moves it learns lean toward darkness and confusion, and its typing makes it one of the rare Pokémon that, at the time of its introduction, could not be struck super effectively by any other type. It is a Pokémon designed around restriction, and the restriction is also its mystery. Across the sea from Hoenn, in the wide and cold region known as Unova, there is a small ghost-type Pokémon called Yamask. It is humanoid in shape, drifting slowly through dark places, and it carries a small golden mask in its tiny hands. The mask is what makes Yamask difficult to forget once you have read its Pokédex entry. The entry explains quietly that Yamask was once a human being. The mask it carries is described as the face it wore in life, and when Yamask looks at the mask, it is said to cry tears that fall from eyes that were not the original eyes of that human face. The transformation from person to Pokémon is treated as already complete, already in the past, and the only remaining trace of the original life is the small object held carefully in front of its small body. The series rarely makes statements this direct about the relationship between humans and Pokémon. There are myths in many regions that hint at people becoming Pokémon long ago, or being reborn as Pokémon after their human lives ended, but Yamask is one of the few cases where the Pokédex itself confirms that a specific creature is the result of that transformation. The detail makes Yamask quietly one of the most unsettling Pokémon in the entire series, even though its design is small and soft. If we trust the entry, then somewhere in the past of the Pokémon world, a person died and continued to exist in a different form. We do not learn how, we do not learn when, and we do not learn whether the transformation was chosen or imposed. We only learn that the new form remembers, and that it carries the memory in the shape of a mask that no one else can take from it. This kind of sustained quietness is part of why Yamask has become one of the most discussed Pokémon among players who think about the deeper lore. The information given is enough to raise questions, but never enough to settle them. The transformation could have been a curse, or it could have been a gift, or it could have been the natural outcome of something the games will never describe directly. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at a forest in the Kalos region, where small ghost and grass-type Pokémon hide among the roots of old trees. The Pokémon is called Phantump, and like Yamask, its origin is described in terms that suggest a human past. The Pokédex entry explains that Phantump are formed when the spirit of a child who became lost in the forest enters an old tree stump and remains there. The exact reason the children became lost is not given. The exact forest is not specified. The exact century is not provided. What we have instead is the suggestion of an event that happened often enough to produce a recognizable Pokémon species, and the implication that the forest itself has been holding small spirits for a long time. The cry of a Phantump is sometimes described in the entry as resembling the voice of a child calling out for someone. When players walk through the forest paths of Kalos and encounter a Phantump, they are technically meeting a small green Pokémon with a wooden body and large hollow eyes. But the entries quietly suggest that they are also meeting a memory, a small piece of a story that began before the player's adventure and that will continue after the player has moved on to the next route. The encounter is a Pokémon battle on the surface, but it is something gentler and stranger underneath. The series has never followed up on Phantump's origin in a way that would close the question. There are no parents who appear in town to mourn the lost children, no missing persons posters, no detective figures who try to investigate. The forest simply holds what it holds, and the trees continue to creak in the wind, and the Phantump continue to drift between the roots, carrying whatever they once were. What makes this mystery feel especially careful is how easily a player can pass through the whole story without noticing it. Phantump can be caught quickly, evolved into Trevenant, and slotted into a team without the player ever opening the Pokédex entry. The mystery exists, but it does not insist on being seen, and it waits patiently for the players who will eventually pause and read. In the long region of Sinnoh, there is a particular Pokémon that floats above small towns near the lakes and the rivers, drifting in clusters whenever the calendar arrives at a certain day of the week. The Pokémon is called Drifloon, and the Pokédex entries that describe it have always carried a strange and gentle warning. Drifloon, the entries say, has been known to take small children by the hand and lead them away into places they did not expect to go. The implication is light enough that the series can keep it as a footnote, but firm enough that the warning has stayed in the Pokédex across multiple generations. Drifloon are sometimes described as the spirits of those who could not move on, sometimes as creatures that mistake the act of leading for the act of helping, and sometimes simply as balloons with intentions of their own. The exact mechanism is never explained. To find Drifloon in the wild during the original Sinnoh games, a player must walk to a specific power plant on a specific day of the week, and only on that day will the Drifloon appear floating beside the door. This timing detail makes the encounter feel ritualistic, as if Drifloon's presence is governed by something larger than the player's schedule. It comes once a week, and only once, and if you miss it, you wait again. The visual design of Drifloon supports the unease around its lore. The body is balloon-like. The colors are soft purple and yellow, the limbs are small white wisps, and the face is a cross-shaped marking that suggests something between a child's drawing and a folk art symbol. From a distance, Drifloon looks playful and approachable. From a closer reading, it looks like a thing you might have been told to walk away from when you were small. The mystery here is not whether Drifloon is dangerous. The mystery is whether the danger is intended. The games allow for the possibility that Drifloon do not understand what they are doing when they take a child's hand, that the loss of the child is a sad accident rather than a deliberate act, and that the Pokémon itself might never have meant anything cruel. But the games also allow for the other possibility, and they have never closed the door between the two. Tucked into a corner of the forest near Lostlorn, in the Unova region, there is a small abandoned house that the player can enter if they happen to wander far enough off the main path. The house has no current occupants, no trainer waiting inside, and no obvious item to collect on the first visit. What it contains instead is a single bedroom upstairs and a strange series of events that occur if the player is patient enough to wait inside it after dark. If the player enters the bedroom and stands in a particular spot for long enough, a small invisible presence begins to move objects in the room. A doll is pushed across the floor, a bed is rearranged. Footsteps can be heard pacing back and forth, even though no character is visible to the camera. The events build slowly, with each visit adding a little more to the disturbance, until at last the source of the activity is revealed. The source turns out to be a small Rotom or a Banette, depending on the version of the game and the era, but the revelation does not entirely resolve the mystery. The house remains abandoned, the owners are never described, the reason for the haunting is never explained. The Pokémon that caused the disturbances simply leaves or is captured, and the house returns to silence. What makes the Strange House so quietly unforgettable is how thoroughly it leans into the rhythm of a small ghost story without ever forcing the player to engage with it. The whole sequence can be skipped without missing any important item, any major Pokémon, or any required event for the main plot. It is entirely optional. It exists only for the players who walk in and choose to stay. The choice to include something like this in a game aimed at a broad audience says something about the developer's confidence in the players. They trusted that some players would find the house, would feel the quiet, would notice the doll moving, and would understand without being told that they had walked into a story the game was not going to explain. The story exists only for those willing to read it slowly. Deeper into the Sinnoh region, hidden inside the Eterna forest, there is another quiet building called the Old Chateau. It sits behind a few tall trees, accessible only through a small turn off the main route, and most players pass it by entirely on their first journey through. Inside the chateau, there are long hallways lit by dim chandeliers, tables set with plates and chairs that have not been used in years, and the soft sound of wood creaking in the upstairs rooms. In one of the upstairs rooms, a small ghost child is sometimes seen standing in the corner. The child says nothing, the camera does not focus on them, and the next time the player looks at the same spot, the child is gone. In another room, food appears on a table that no one is using. In a third room, the lights flicker on and off without any explanation, and the player's own footsteps seem to echo a beat longer than they should. The chateau is home to Rotom, the small ghost and electric Pokémon that can possess household appliances and animate them with its own playful personality. The encounter with Rotom resolves part of the haunting, but the chateau itself remains full of details that Rotom alone cannot explain. The child in the corner is not Rotom. The footsteps in the hall are not Rotom. The cold air in the dining room is not Rotom either. What we are told indirectly is that the chateau was once a noble's residence, that the family who lived there left for unknown reasons, and that the building has been sitting empty for a very long time. The exact century is not given. The fate of the family is not revealed. The connection between the family's departure and the small ghosts that linger in the building is left for the player to assemble from inference and atmosphere. The Old Chateau is one of the clearest examples of the series choosing to build a mystery around silence rather than around explanation. There is no journal to find, no NPC to interview, no quest to complete that will reveal the answers. The chateau simply exists, and the player either walks through it carefully or walks through it quickly, and either way, the building keeps its history to itself. If you continue past the chateau and through the rest of Sinnoh's middle routes, you eventually find yourself at the base of a great mountain called Mount Coronet. The mountain runs through the heart of the region, dividing it almost perfectly in half, and at its summit is a place known as Spear Pillar. The pillar is not a single column, but a wide, flat plateau of ancient stone, arranged in patterns that suggest deliberate construction, and the patterns suggest something far older than any building in any nearby town. The legends connected to Spear Pillar describe it as the place where the world was first stitched together. According to the local myths, 3 Pokémon emerged from a great being at the dawn of existence, and one of them shaped time, another shaped space, and the third shaped something the legends call antimatter, or the unseen world. The pillar at the top of the mountain is said to be the place where this emergence happened, and it is said to remain sensitive to anyone who tries to disturb it. In the events of the main story, a group of antagonists climb to the pillar and attempt to use a pair of ancient artifacts to summon one of these creation Pokémon and bend its powers to their own design. The summoning works, briefly. The world's basic rules begin to fray, the sky changes color, and the boundaries between dimensions thin. The player intervenes, the summoning is interrupted, and the creation Pokémon either returns to wherever it came from or chooses to remain in this layer of reality. The pillar itself, after the events conclude, returns to its quiet form. The patterns in the stone remain. The wind continues to move across the plateau. The mountain continues to divide the region. None of the great events that have just occurred leave a visible mark on the place where they happened, and the player walks back down the mountain through the same caves they used to climb up. What lingers about Spear Pillar is the suggestion that the entire setting of the games rests on a foundation laid down by a small set of original Pokémon. The world we walk through is not background. The world we walk through is a thing one of those Pokémon shaped, and the pillar at the top of the mountain is the place where the shaping was done. Everything else, including the towns and the routes and the small mysteries we have already discussed, exists because something at the pillar made it possible. Behind the events at Spear Pillar, in a layer of reality that the games describe as folded slightly out of phase with our own, there is a place called the Distortion World. The player enters it once, near the end of the Sinnoh adventure, and the experience of walking through it is unlike anything else the series has ever produced. Gravity behaves strangely. Platforms float without supports. Waterfalls fall sideways. The horizon bends in places where it should be flat, and the music, when there is music, is thin and uncertain. The Distortion World is the home of Giratina, the third of the creation Pokémon born at Spear Pillar. Giratina is described as having been banished there, sometimes for its violent behavior, sometimes for its incompatibility with the main world, sometimes simply because its existence required a separate layer of reality to contain it. The exact reason varies between sources, and the games do not commit to a single version of the story. What the games do show is that the distortion world exists in a kind of mirror relationship with the ordinary world. Events in one can influence events in the other. Certain Pokémon and items can pass between them under rare conditions, and the boundary between the two has been thin in specific places in the past. Spear Pillar itself is one of those places, and a small cave called Turnback Cave is another. After the player completes the events at the pillar and meets Giratina inside the distortion world, they return to the ordinary world and the boundary closes again. The distortion world does not reappear in the main story. It can be glimpsed only through a few specific items and a few rare encounters in later games, and even then, the visits are brief. The world remains there, behind the world we know, continuing to exist whether or not we are looking at it. This is part of what makes the distortion world feel important, even when the games are not actively drawing attention to it. The implication is that everything we do in the visible part of the Pokémon world is happening alongside, and sometimes against, something larger. The mountain at the center of the region is not just a mountain. The cave near it is not just a cave. The pillar at its summit is a doorway, and the doorway has been used. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at a cave hidden on the eastern edge of Sinnoh, far from the main road, accessible only through a long stretch of foggy water that most players never sail across. The cave is called Turnback Cave, and the structure of it is unusual even by the standards of the games. The interior is a series of rooms connected by doors, but the doors do not always lead where the layout suggests they should, and the geography of the cave shifts each time the player enters. The cave is full of voices, though no characters are visibly present. As the player walks through the rooms, they sometimes hear footsteps that do not match their own, faint cries that have no source, and rustling sounds in corners where nothing is moving. The Pokémon that appear inside the cave are mostly ghost types, and the encounter rate is high, suggesting that the place is dense with spiritual activity. At the deepest reachable point of the cave, after the player has navigated through a specific sequence of rooms in a specific order, they reach a small chamber where Giratina itself appears. The encounter is silent and brief. There is no cutscene, no dialogue, no fanfare, only the appearance of a creature that should not be in this layer of reality at all, drifting in the chamber as if it had simply walked through a door that had been left slightly open. The cave seems to function as a thin place between worlds. The distortion world presses against it. Giratina uses it as a passage between the two layers. The voices in the corridors are perhaps not voices at all, but echoes of what is happening on the other side of the boundary, leaking through into the player's hearing. The exact mechanism is not described, but the effect is unmistakable. After the encounter, Giratina either returns with the player or remains in the cave, depending on the player's choice. The cave itself stays as it was, with its shifting rooms and its quiet voices, and players can return at any time to wander through it again. The mystery is not solved by the visit. The mystery is only confirmed. In the snowy north of the same region, where the wind blows steadily across long stretches of white ground, there is a small ruin called the Snow Point Temple. The temple is closed for most of the main story. A man stands at the entrance and explains that something is being kept inside and that opening the door is not advisable for ordinary travelers. Only after the player has completed a specific later task does the door open, and only then can the interior be explored. Inside the temple, the player walks down through layers of ice, deeper than seems geographically reasonable for the size of the building visible from the outside. Each layer is a puzzle involving floors that crack and pillars that block the path, and the further down the player goes, the colder and quieter the rooms become. At the bottom, sealed behind a final layer of ice, is a Pokémon known as Regigigas. Regigigas is described as the Pokémon that pulled the continents into their current shape long ago. The legends say it dragged the great masses of land across the surface of the world, joining some and separating others, and the world we now walk through is the result of its work. After the work was finished, Regigigas fell into a long rest, and the temple was built around it to keep it undisturbed. The connection between Regigigas and the three smaller Regis spread across the earlier region of Hoenn is implied rather than stated. The Pokédex entries suggest that the smaller Regis were created or directed by Regigigas, and that the three of them are still bound to the larger one in some way. When the player encounters all three smaller Regis and brings them together in the right place, Regigigas can be awakened, and the chain becomes visible. The mystery here is not who Regigigas is. The mystery is what it intends to do when it wakes. The legends describe its past work, but they do not describe its future plans. After the player encounters it and either captures it or defeats it, the temple becomes quiet again, and the great Pokémon either rests or is now in the player's care, and the story of the moving continents ends without further chapter. The three smaller Regis themselves are spread across the Hoenn region, each sealed inside a separate ruin in a separate climate. One sits in a desert, one sits in a frozen cavern, one sits in a deep underwater chamber. Each of them is hidden behind a specific code carved into stone, and each of them can only be reached by a player who has gathered the right tools and learned the right rituals from the right elderly figure in a small distant village. The codes that open the ruins are themselves part of the mystery. They are written in a script that is not the standard text of the games, and they describe specific actions the player must perform in specific orders. The player must walk in a particular pattern across the floor, must use a particular item at a particular moment, and must arrive at the inner chamber with a particular Pokémon in their party. Only then does the door open. Inside the ruins, the Regis themselves are silent. They are large, ancient, and clearly made of something other than ordinary flesh. One is made of stone, one is made of ice, one is made of metal. Their faces are featureless, beyond a few patterned dots that suggest eyes, and their movements during the battle are slow and deliberate, as if they are not entirely awake. The series has never fully explained where the Regis came from, who built the ruins, or who left the codes for future generations to find. The general implication is that they predate any current civilization, that the ruins were already old when the towns near them were first founded, and that whatever culture knew how to seal them is no longer present to explain its work. The codes were left behind in the hope that someday someone would find them again. That hope is the part of the mystery that lingers. Someone, long ago, considered the possibility that the seals might one day need to be opened. They wrote down the instructions in a script they expected future people to be able to read. They trusted that the world would still have curious travelers, and that those travelers would find their way to the ruins, and that the work of sealing and unsealing would continue across centuries. The Regis are not just Pokémon in caves. They are messages from a culture that is gone. In the small Hoenn town of Lily Cove, in a shop near the marketplace, there is a single item sometimes visible on a shelf that has not always been on that shelf in earlier games. It is a small carved figure, and the description that accompanies it identifies it as a souvenir from a distant region. The shopkeeper does not explain where the figure came from. The region named on the description does not match any of the regions the player can travel to in the current game. The figure simply sits there, available for purchase, as if it had wandered into the store from somewhere outside the world the game has shown so far. When players first noticed this item, called a strange souvenir in some versions and given other names in others, the implication seemed minor. It was a piece of background detail, a reference to a distant culture, a small flavor item. But over the course of several years, as new games were released and new regions were introduced, the strange souvenir's place became clearer. The region described on its label corresponded to the region of the next game, and the figure appeared to have been quietly placed in the earlier game as a preview of what was coming. This is the kind of mystery that grows backwards. At the time it appeared, it was strange. After the next game came out, it was a hint. After the next game after that, it was part of a pattern. The series began including small references in each game to the next region, and players learned to look at every souvenir, every postcard, every offhand line of dialogue, with the suspicion that it might be pointing somewhere not yet visible. The strange souvenir's most striking feature is how casual it is. There is no fanfare around its placement, no music sting when the player picks it up, no NPC who urgently insists on its meaning. It simply waits on a shelf, and the players who notice it and remember it later become the ones who first connect the dots. The mystery is hidden in plain view, and the only requirement for solving it is patience across multiple games. This pattern of cross-region references quietly suggests something larger about the world of Pokémon. The regions are not isolated. They share trade, share travelers, share small handcrafted objects that move between them on slow paths. The world has more space than any single game ever shows, and the small items in the corners of the shops are reminders that the rest of the space is still there, going about its life, even when the camera is pointed somewhere else. Far above the main story of the Alola region, near the top of a great mountain at the center of the islands, there is a phenomenon that the series introduced in a way unlike anything before it. Holes appear in the sky, called ultra wormholes, and through those holes, Pokémon that no one has ever seen step down into the islands. These Pokémon are referred to as Ultra Beasts, and they do not fit neatly into the existing categories of the regional roster. The Ultra Beasts have unusual designs, unusual movesets, and unusual descriptions in the Pokédex. They are described as having come from somewhere beyond the ordinary world, from a layer of reality the local researchers refer to as ultra space. The exact nature of ultra space is described in terms that suggest many small connected pockets of differently shaped existence, each with its own rules, its own atmosphere, and its own kinds of life. The wormholes do not appear randomly. They are connected to events involving a specific Pokémon called Necrozma, a being that the games describe as having lost its original form long ago. When Necrozma is in certain states, the wormholes open more easily, and the boundary between the ordinary world and ultra space becomes thinner. When the player resolves the situation with Necrozma, the wormholes close most of the way, though small openings remain in certain places for those who know how to look. The implication is that the Pokémon world is not the only world. Other layers exist alongside it, each containing its own kinds of creatures, and under the right conditions, those creatures can step into our layer and look around. The Ultra Beasts that visit Alola are not invaders in any clear sense. They are simply travelers, and their travel is unsettling mostly because it suggests how much else is out there. The mystery here is that we are never told the full scope of Ultra Space. We see a few of its pockets. We meet a few of its inhabitants. We are given hints that there are many more pockets we have not seen, and many more inhabitants we have not met. The wormholes that we close are only the ones we found. The ones we did not find may still be open, somewhere on the islands, drifting quietly above places no one ever visits. If you continue across the Pokémon world to the small archipelago between Hoenn and Kanto, accessible only through specific past distribution events, you arrive at 3 islands that exist only because special items once let players reach them. Birth Island is one of these. Naval Rock is another. Faraway Island, which we have already visited, is the third. Birth Island is a small triangular landmass with almost nothing on it. There are no trees, no buildings, no people. There is only a flat surface and a single set of strange triangular puzzle pieces arranged in a pattern. When the player walks across the pieces in a particular order, the pieces rearrange themselves. After enough movements, a Pokémon appears at the center of the pattern, and that Pokémon is Deoxys. Deoxys is described as a Pokémon born from an alien virus that came down to Earth on a meteor. The exact location of its arrival is never specified. The exact circumstances of its formation are described only briefly, and the reason it ended up on Birth Island specifically is not explained at all. The Pokémon is simply there, waiting on a small island, surrounded by triangular tiles that the player must walk in the right pattern to disturb. The strangeness of this encounter is increased by Deoxys' ability to shift between several physical forms. It has a form built for attack. It has a form built for defense. It has a form built for speed. It has a form that is treated as the default. The same Pokémon can move between these shapes under certain conditions, and the implication is that none of them is more real than the others. Birth Island as a place feels almost ceremonial. The arrangement of the tiles, the absence of any other features, the silence as the player walks through the patterns, all of it suggests that the island was built or shaped specifically for this encounter. We do not know who built it. We do not know who designed the puzzle. We do not know who decided that Deoxys should rest there, or for how long it has been resting, or whether the island existed before the meteor or after. Like Faraway Island, Birth Island is reachable only through special events that occurred during specific years. Once those events ended, the path to the island closed. Players who experienced the encounter remember it. Players who did not can read about it, but cannot visit it themselves. The mystery, in a way, became part of the world's mythology, rather than part of its accessible map. Navel Rock, the third of these special islands, is a small volcanic outcropping where two of the most ancient Pokémon in the series are said to rest. At the top of the rock, where the air smells of fire, Ho-Oh waits. At the bottom of the rock, where the water is dark and still, Lugia waits. The two Pokémon do not appear together. They are kept on opposite ends of the same small island, separated by stairs and silence. Ho-Oh is the rainbow Pokémon, the same creature mentioned earlier in connection with Pokémon Tower in Kanto. Lugia is described as the guardian of the seas, a creature whose movements can stir storms strong enough to reshape coastlines. The two of them are sometimes spoken of as counterparts, with Ho-Oh associated with the sky and Lugia with the depths, and the implication is that they were once seen together by some long-ago observer who recorded their separate domains. The reason both Pokémon rest on Navel Rock is not entirely explained. The island is small, the climb is short, and the only feature of note is the path that leads from the volcanic top to the dark watery base. The two Pokémon are simply there, available to a player with the right item from the right event, and once captured or defeated, they leave the island and do not return. What makes Navel Rock feel particularly old is the way the series treats both Pokémon in their other appearances. Ho-Oh is associated with two towers in another region, one of which burned long ago. Lugia is associated with three smaller bird Pokémon that fly between distant islands. The two of them have presences that ripple outward into the rest of the world's lore, and the small rock between Hoenn and Kanto seems to be only one of many places they touch. The series has never said directly whether Navel Rock is their original home or simply one of many places they visit, or a kind of secondary resting spot they share. The island is too small to support either of them permanently, and yet the games place them there as if the location is settled. The reason is left for the player to wonder about, and the wonder has continued across many years of speculation. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the eastern coast of the Hoenn region, where a tall, thin tower rises near the sea. The tower is called the Sky Pillar, and it is older than any of the towns that surround it. The walls are weathered, the stairs are worn, and the rooms are mostly empty except for a few floor tiles that suggest puzzles long since forgotten. The pillar is closed to most travelers, and only after a series of specific events in the main story does the player gain permission to climb it. At the very top of the pillar, in a small open chamber, Rayquaza rests. Rayquaza is described as a Pokémon that lives in the upper atmosphere, drifting through the layers of cloud above the world, descending only when something important enough draws it down. The Sky Pillar is the place it comes to when it needs to rest near the ground, and the tower seems to have been built specifically to give it a place to land. The events that bring Rayquaza down in the main story involve two other powerful Pokémon clashing in the sea below. One of them stirs the oceans into violent storms, and the other dries the land with waves of heat, and the conflict between them threatens to tear the region apart. Rayquaza descends from the sky and resolves the conflict, returning the sea and the land to their proper balance, and then climbs back to its perch at the top of the pillar. The mystery of the Sky Pillar is not the dragon at the top. The mystery is the pillar itself. Who built it, when, and why? The structure was placed there with apparent foresight, anticipating that a Pokémon as large as Rayquaza would need somewhere to land. The walls are old enough that no recorded culture in the games remembers building them, and the surrounding region has no nearby villages whose history would account for the construction. The pattern of mysteries involving ancient ruins continues to suggest a previous civilization, one that knew about powerful Pokémon, that understood their habits well enough to build resting places for them, and that left those resting places behind when it disappeared. The pillar, the temple, the underwater chamber, the desert ruin, the frozen cave, all of these structures share a quality of patient construction, and none of them have caretakers from the current age. In the mountains of the same region, just outside the city of Moss Deep, there is a tall, lonely peak called Mount Pyre. The mountain is a graveyard, similar in some ways to Pokémon Tower in Kanto, but larger and more open. The slopes are dotted with stone markers, the air is quiet and cold, and the people who visit do so to leave small offerings for Pokémon that have passed on. At the summit, an elderly couple watches over two ancient orbs. The orbs are called the Red Orb and the Blue Orb. Each one is associated with one of the two great Pokémon involved in the conflict that Rayquaza eventually resolves. The orbs are described as containing or controlling the powers of those Pokémon, and the elderly couple at the summit has been keeping them safe for many years, away from anyone who might try to use them for the wrong reasons. In the events of the main story, antagonists climb the mountain and take one of the orbs. They use it to awaken the corresponding Pokémon, and the consequences spread across the region in the form of violent weather. The other orb remains at the summit, and the elderly couple continues their watch, hoping that the situation will be resolved before both Pokémon are loose at the same time. The mystery of Mount Pyre is what the orbs actually are. The games describe them as artifacts, but they do not describe who made them, when, or how. The orbs seem to be older than the mountain itself, older than the graveyard, older than the city below. The elderly couple inherited the responsibility of keeping them, and they speak of their own grandparents having done the same, and the chain of caretakers stretches back beyond what anyone can remember. This is a recurring shape in the Pokémon mysteries. An object exists. A duty exists around the object. The duty is passed down through generations. The original maker of the object, and the original reason for the duty are forgotten. The world we walk through is full of these inherited responsibilities, carried by people who never met the people who first took them up. If you walk along the coast of the Hoenn region long enough, you eventually reach a city built inside a crater. The city is called Sootopolis, and its design is so unusual that it raises questions before any of its citizens have spoken. The crater is wide and deep, almost perfectly circular, and the buildings inside it are arranged in rings around a central pool. The walls of the crater are too steep for ordinary travelers to climb, and the only entrance is through an underwater passage that requires a specific Pokémon move to navigate. The crater is described as having been formed long ago by a meteor that fell from the sky. The impact was so great that it carved out the entire basin in a single moment, and the city was eventually built inside the resulting bowl by people who saw the shelter as a sign of something larger than ordinary geology. The pool at the center of the city is connected to a deeper system of underground caves and waterways, and the whole place has the feeling of being both a town and a temple at the same time. In the events of the main story, the two great Pokémon awakened from the orbs at Mount Pyre eventually meet in the pool at the center of Sootopolis. Their clash threatens to destroy the city and the surrounding region, and the storm above the crater becomes so dense that the sky is no longer visible. Rayquaza arrives, the storm clears, and the two great Pokémon are calmed. The mystery here is the meteor. The city was built inside a crater, and the crater was made by a falling object, and the falling object is never described in detail. We do not know what was inside the meteor. We do not know whether it was an ordinary rock or something more unusual. We do not know whether its arrival had any connection to the deeper events of the region, or whether the timing of its fall was coincidence. Some players, looking at the patterns across many games, have wondered whether the meteor that formed Sootopolis is the same kind of meteor that brought Deoxys to Birth Island. The series has never confirmed this. The connection would be elegant, but the games leave it unstated, and the meteor in the crater remains just a meteor, with whatever it carried still buried somewhere beneath the city, or long since absorbed into the water. Below the same region, in a small underwater chamber, accessible only through a series of dives, there is a place called the Cave of Origin. The cave is small, dimly lit, and almost empty except for a few stone pillars and a single deep chamber at its center. The descriptions associated with it suggest that this is one of the places where the region's first life forms emerged, and that the water inside the cave has properties that ordinary water does not. The Pokémon associated with the Cave of Origin is, depending on the version of the game, either the Great Water Pokémon or the Great Land Pokémon from the orbs at Mount Pyre. The cave is described as a kind of nursery or sanctuary for them, and the implication is that they have rested there in deep sleep for periods of time that no calendar can measure. The cave's existence is mostly known only to scholars and a few residents of Sootopolis above. The mystery of the Cave of Origin is similar to the mystery of Spear Pillar in the next region. Both places are described as foundational, as locations where something fundamental about the world happened. Both are quiet, modest in scale, and easy to miss if a player is not looking for them. The series places enormous historical weight on these small, unmarked rooms, and then leaves them alone for the player to find. There is a recurring pattern in this kind of design. The most important places in the world are not the most visually impressive places. The biggest cities are not the foundational sites. The capital towns are not the locations where the world began. The world began in caves and on pillars and inside small, unremarkable chambers, and the cities grew up later, often without remembering what was buried beneath them. This pattern carries a quiet message about how the games view history. The past is not something that gets paved over completely. The past is still there, just below the current surface, and the right kind of traveler can still find it. The cave is not closed. The pillar is not collapsed. The temple is not destroyed. They are simply waiting the way they have always waited for someone to walk in and notice. Across the ocean, in the calmer waters near several different regions, there is a Pokémon that travelers occasionally encounter as they cross from one place to another. The Pokémon is called Lapras, and its presence in the games is gentle and infrequent. It is large, blue, soft-faced, and willing to carry trainers across long stretches of water on its back. The Pokédex entries describe it as a creature that once existed in great numbers but has become rare due to a long period of overhunting. The entries also describe Lapra as a singer. Its voice is said to be unusually beautiful, capable of carrying long distances across calm water, and capable of expressing complex emotions in tones that no other Pokémon shares. In several entries, the songs of Lapras are described as melancholy, as expressions of loss for the family members the species has lost over the years. The mystery is what the songs actually are. The series treats them as expressions, as something close to language, but no character ever fully translates a Lapras song. We are told that the songs exist, that they carry meaning, and that the meaning is sad. We are not told the specific words, if there are words. We are not told whether the songs are passed down between generations or composed anew by each individual Lapras. There is a particular sadness in the way the games handle this Pokémon. The species is rare, the songs are sad, the population has been reduced by human action, and yet Lapras is willing to carry trainers on its back when asked. The willingness suggests forgiveness, or perhaps a kind of patience that the species has cultivated over the long centuries of decline. The mystery of Lapras is gentle and slow. It is not a puzzle to be solved with a key item or a specific dialogue choice. It is a sustained, quiet question about a creature whose history is older than its hunters, whose voice is older than the languages currently spoken in any town. The songs continue, and the Lapras continue, and the players who pause to listen are the ones who hear the most. In the small starting town of Kanto, in a route just north of the player's home, there is a small mound of dirt that sometimes shows a small head poking up out of the ground. The head belongs to a Pokémon called Diglett, and the description that accompanies it raises a quiet question that the games have never fully answered. The Pokédex describes Diglett as a creature that lives entirely underground, that only its head is ever seen above the surface, and that the rest of its body extends far down into the earth in shapes that no one has ever clearly observed. This is a strange detail when considered carefully. We have never seen the lower half of a Diglett. The games have not shown it in any official artwork, in any animation, in any model. The species exists as a recognizable Pokémon, but the recognition is based entirely on its visible portion, and the invisible portion is left to the imagination. Some players have speculated that the invisible portion is shaped like a human leg, or several legs, or something insect-like, or simply a long worm-like body. Others have speculated that there is nothing below it all, that Diglett's visible head is the entire creature, and that the description of an extended underground form is a kind of joke or misdirection. The series has never confirmed any of these theories. What we are told is that Diglett moves rapidly through soil, that it can travel long distances underground without surfacing, and that it forms tunnels wherever it lives. A whole cave system in the original Kanto region is named Diglett's Cave, and the tunnels inside that cave are large enough for a human to walk through. The implication is that whatever the lower body of a Diglett looks like, it is large enough to dig passages a person can use. The mystery of Diglett is one of the smaller and quieter ones in the series, but it has lasted for nearly 30 years without resolution. Every new game that includes Diglett continues to show only the head. The species remains exactly as mysterious as it was at the beginning, and the lower body remains exactly as unseen. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the breeding mechanics of the games, which most players use without thinking about the questions they raise. Pokémon of compatible groups can produce offspring together, regardless of size or shape or species, and the offspring will hatch from an egg as the lowest evolutionary stage of the mother species. This system works smoothly in most cases, but in certain cases, it raises questions that the games never address directly. One of the most famous examples involves two Pokémon called Wailord and Skitty. Wailord is a massive whale-shaped Pokémon, one of the largest creatures in the entire series, reaching lengths comparable to real-world whales. Skitty is a small cat-shaped Pokémon, roughly the size of a domestic kitten. Both belong to the same compatibility group in the breeding system, and according to the rules of the game, they can produce offspring together. The biological mechanics of how this would actually work are not described. The games simply allow the pairing. The egg hatches as a baby Skitty, and the player moves on. The size difference between the two parents is not mentioned in any dialogue. The matchmaker in the breeding center does not comment on it, and no Pokédex entry attempts to explain it. This kind of unaddressed strangeness is part of what makes the breeding system feel like its own little world inside the larger games. The rules are clear and consistent, but the explanations for those rules are absent. The system functions, and the absence of explanation is treated as if it were entirely ordinary. The mystery is not really a mystery of how, but a mystery of why the games chose to leave the question unanswered. The developers presumably knew that players would notice the strange pairings. They presumably anticipated that some players would laugh about them, and others would ask serious questions about how the world was supposed to work. The choice to allow the pairings without commentary is its own kind of statement, and the statement is something like a quiet shrug. If you spend enough time in the early roots of any region, you will eventually find yourself catching a small water Pokémon called Magikarp. Magikarp is famous for being weak. Its early moveset is shallow, its battle performance is minimal, and the only thing it tends to do for many levels is splash uselessly back and forth in the water. Trainers who train it patiently are rewarded with one of the most powerful Pokémon in the series. Trainers who give up on it never see what it could have become. The Pokédex entries for Magikarp suggest something else interesting about the species. They describe Magikarp as having been around for a very long time, far longer than most other Pokémon, and they describe a small number of unusually strong individuals that have been observed leaping up waterfalls and climbing against currents that ordinary fish cannot survive. The leaping behavior is described as ancient, as something the species has been doing for centuries. There is a particular legend mentioned in one of the regions about a Magikarp that climbed a great waterfall and transformed at the top into something far larger and more dangerous. The transformation is said to be the origin of Gyarados, the long serpent-shaped Pokémon that Magikarp eventually evolves into. The legend treats this transformation as both biological and spiritual, as if the act of climbing the waterfall earned the Magikarp the right to become something new. The mystery is whether the legend is literally true or merely a folk explanation for the evolution that the games already implement. The games allow any Magikarp, given enough experience, to evolve into Gyarados. There is no waterfall requirement. There is no spiritual test. The transformation is mechanical, triggered by experience points and level thresholds. And yet the legend persists in the entries, suggesting that something more ceremonial was once involved. This double layering of explanation, where the mechanics of the game and the lore of the world do not perfectly match, is common across the Pokémon series. The games tell us how things work in the rules of play, and the lore tells us how those same things were explained by people who lived in the world before the rules existed. The two explanations coexist, neither completely overriding the other, and the player is left to decide which version to believe. In a quiet northern region of Johto, surrounded by tall grasses and gentle hills, there is a small lake called the Lake of Rage. The water in the lake is almost still, the air around it is heavy, and at certain times of the year, a single Pokémon appears at the center of the surface. The Pokémon is a Gyarados, the same kind that Magikarp eventually evolves into, but this particular Gyarados is colored red instead of the usual blue. The lore around the red Gyarados describes it as the result of unnatural experimentation. A group of antagonists in the region were attempting to force the evolution of large numbers of Magikarp through artificial means, accelerating the transformation past its natural pace. The red Gyarados is one of the unintended results of this experimentation, a creature whose colors do not match the standard pattern of its species because something about its evolution went wrong. The game presents this Pokémon as a tragedy of sorts. The Gyarados is angry, the lake is restless, and the surrounding roots are full of trainers who have come either to investigate the disturbance or to take advantage of it. The player eventually battles or captures the red Gyarados, and the lake calms, and the roots return to their ordinary patterns. The mystery of the red Gyarados is the deeper question of what else the experimentation produced. The games show us one altered Pokémon, but the methods used to alter it were applied to many. The fate of the others is not described. The other Magikarp that were affected may have died, may have evolved normally, may have been released somewhere we never see, or may still be in cages somewhere, off the main path of the story. The series has never returned to this question. The red Gyarados appears, the lake calms, the antagonists are defeated, and the consequences fade, but the implication that there were more affected Pokémon than just one continues to sit quietly in the background, and the lake, even after the events of the main story conclude, still feels like a place where something is being remembered. In the eastern part of the next region, hidden behind a long sequence of caves and accessible only after a difficult climb, there is an active volcano called Stark Mountain. The mountain is not on the main path of the regional adventure. It is reachable only after the main story has been completed, through a side quest involving a few specific characters and a long stretch of underground travel. At the heart of the mountain, in a chamber filled with magma, a Pokémon called Heatran rests. Heatran is described as a creature made partly of metal, capable of walking on walls and ceilings as easily as on the floor, and resistant to temperatures that would melt ordinary materials. The chamber at the heart of Stark Mountain is its home, and the description suggests that Heatran has lived there for a very long time, predating the existence of the local towns and possibly predating the volcano's last major eruption. What makes the Stark Mountain situation a mystery is the way the local researchers and characters react to its discovery. They are nervous about the implications of disturbing Heatran. They speak about the mountain's stability being tied to the Pokémon's mood. They suggest that if Heatran were ever to leave the chamber permanently, the volcano might respond in ways that the surrounding region would not be able to handle. The implication is that this single Pokémon is doing something important by simply existing where it exists. Its presence keeps the mountain calm. Its absence would not be a neutral event. The relationship between Heatran and the volcano is not described in scientific terms, but in something closer to spiritual or ecological terms, as if the Pokémon is a kind of caretaker or anchor. This pattern, where the geological stability of a place depends on the presence of a specific Pokémon, recurs in several other regions. The pattern suggests a model of the world in which the natural features we take for granted, the volcanoes and the storms and the seasons, are not simply natural forces, but the visible expressions of relationships between certain Pokémon and their environments. The mystery is how many other features of the world are like this, and how many we are taking for granted without realizing what is keeping them stable. If you continue across the Pokémon world to certain side quests in specific games, you eventually encounter a mischievous small Pokémon called Hoopa. Hoopa is described as a Pokémon that can create rings, and the rings are not ordinary rings. They open portals to other places, and Hoopa is said to have used them to steal objects from distant lands, sometimes including very large objects, sometimes including entire mountains, sometimes including buildings that were never meant to be moved. The series treats Hoopa as a kind of trickster figure. Its behavior is playful but disruptive, and the items it gathers through its rings are scattered across the world in ways that make no geographical sense. A treasure from one region might appear in another. A relic from one culture might end up in the basement of a museum on the opposite side of the map. The series suggests that some of the strange historical mismatches we see in towns and caves may be due to Hoopa's interference over the centuries. There is a secondary form of Hoopa that the games introduce, in which the small, mischievous body grows enormous, and its rings become large enough to pull through truly massive objects. In this form, Hoopa is described as having once moved entire mountain ranges and altered the layouts of regions through its ring portals. The smaller form is what most players encounter. The larger form is suggested as a power that Hoopa once used freely, but now uses only rarely. The mystery of Hoopa is what it has actually moved, and what it has left where. The games tell us that the rings have been used. The games tell us that objects have been transported. The games do not tell us a complete list. Or there may be entire features of the world we have walked past without realizing that they originated somewhere else, brought to their current location by a Pokémon that found them interesting. This kind of mystery is particularly destabilizing for players who have come to know the regions as familiar places. The thought that pieces of those regions may have come from elsewhere, deposited by a playful Pokémon's portals, changes the way the maps feel. The world is not entirely what it appears to be, and the explanation is not malice or conspiracy, but the casual mischief of a creature with the power to rearrange the geography of the world. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at a Pokémon called Volcanion, which appears in a small handful of events tied to specific games and films. Volcanion is unusual in that it combines two elemental types that almost no other Pokémon shares, fire and water, in a way that produces a creature whose body is described as constantly steaming. The steam itself is said to be capable of creating dense clouds, and Volcanion is sometimes described as a Pokémon that can hide entire mountains beneath the fog of its own breath. The exact habitat of Volcanion is described as a remote hot spring valley, far from any major town, where the water and the heat combine in conditions that no other place in the region replicates. The Pokémon is said to live alone there, or with very few companions, and to avoid contact with humans whenever possible. The encounters with Volcanion that occur during events are described as exceptional rather than typical. The mystery here is partly about Volcanion itself, and partly about the place where it lives. The series gives us the impression that there are valleys and hot springs, and remote hidden geographies that the main maps do not cover, and that some Pokémon make their homes in those uncharted places. We meet Volcanion only when it chooses to be met, and the rest of its life is left in the obscured territory of the world's unmapped corners. This is a kind of mystery that does not require a puzzle to solve. It simply requires acknowledgement. The world is bigger than the maps. The Pokémon that live in the unmapped places have lives we do not see. The encounters that happen in the visible places are only a small fraction of the encounters that exist somewhere in the world at any given time. There is something gentle about this acknowledgement. It suggests that the player's adventure, no matter how complete it feels, is only one thread in a much larger pattern. The other threads continue without our involvement. The hot springs continue to steam. The Volcanion continues to walk through its valley. The world goes on quietly even when no game is being played. In the cold northern reaches of the Galar region, far from the main cities, there is a small ritual location known as the Crown Shrine. The shrine is set among trees, surrounded by snow, and approached through a long, quiet path that the player walks slowly. At the center of the shrine, beneath a structure of stone and wood, a Pokémon called Calyrex waits in a form that suggests both nobility and exhaustion. Calyrex is described as having been the ruler of the region long ago. The legend says that this Pokémon once governed the land peacefully, that the harvests were rich during its rule, and that the people who lived in the region thrived under its quiet care. Then something happened, the rule ended, and Calyrex withdrew from public view, settling into the shrine where it can now be found only by travelers who have brought a specific offering. The exact reason Calyrex stopped ruling is not entirely explained. There are suggestions that it lost a key part of its strength, that it was abandoned by the people who once relied on it, and that its current state is one of waiting rather than retirement. The shrine is a place of preserved royalty, and the Pokémon inside it is a king without a kingdom. The mystery of Calyrex is what happened to the kingdom. The Galar region exists in the games as a modern, industrialized land with railways and stadiums and large urban centers. The era of Calyrex's rule is described as ancient, and the transition from the kingdom of the old days to the towns of the current era is not described in any direct way. The kingdom faded, the shrines were left behind, and the people moved on without remembering the king clearly. This is another version of a recurring shape we have seen. The past is present in the landscape, but the path from past to present is missing. The shrine is here, the Pokémon is here, the kingdom is gone, and the story of its ending is not in any of the books the player can read. The story of Calyrex is closely tied to two other Pokémon, called Glastrier and Spectrier, who are said to have been the King's Mount during the era of the Old Rule. The two Pokémon were once a single creature, and they were split into two separate forms at some point in the past. One was associated with ice and snow, while the other was associated with shadow and silence. Together with Calyrex, they formed a complete ruler. Apart, they are diminished versions of themselves. The events of the game allow the player to help Calyrex reunite with one of the two steeds, restoring part of the old form and renewing a piece of the kingdom's former power. The other steed remains separated, available in other versions of the game or through trade with other players. The full reunion of all three is something the lore implies, but the standard game does not always allow within a single playthrough. The mystery of Glastrier and Spectrier is how they came to be separated. The lore mentions only that the splitting happened. The mechanism is not described. The intent is not explained. The two Pokémon, when encountered, are wild and strong and somewhat angry, as if they remember a unity they no longer have access to. The implication that powerful Pokémon can be split, that their forms can be divided into pieces, raises questions about other Pokémon throughout the series. The games occasionally hint at fusions, separations, and recombinations. The complete picture of how these processes work is never given. We see individual instances, and the instances suggest a pattern, but the pattern is left unwritten. This is one of the most lore-rich mysteries in the more recent generations of Pokémon games. The events at the Crown Shrine open up a vision of the past that is wider than any single playthrough can fully explore. The king, the steeds, the kingdom, the silence afterward, all of it gestures at a history that the modern game world has nearly forgotten, kept alive only in the small ritual at the shrine and in the wild Pokémon roaming the snowy fields nearby. In the central main story of the same region, before the events at the Crown Shrine become available, a much larger event takes place. It is called the Darkest Day, and it involves a Pokémon called Eternatus rising from beneath the ground at the heart of the region's central city. The Darkest Day is described as a recurring catastrophe that the people of Galar have faced before, sometime in the distant past, and that the present generation has had to face again. The previous Darkest Day, long ago, was apparently stopped by two ancient warriors using two specific weapons that have since become the symbols of the region's two great heroes. The weapons are a sword and a shield, and the modern characters who carry them at the climax of the story are descended in spirit, if not in direct lineage, from those original warriors. The repetition of the catastrophe and the repetition of the response is treated as part of the region's quiet, inherited duty. Eternatus itself is described as a Pokémon that came down from space long ago, similar in some ways to the meteor that fell into Hoenn or the virus that produced Deoxys. Its arrival changed the region, and its presence remained beneath the surface, slowly building up energy that occasionally bursts forth and threatens to consume the land. The pattern of buildup and release is the source of the Darkest Days. The mystery is whether more Darkest Days are coming. The previous one happened long ago. The current one is resolved by the player and the heroes of the story. The implication is that Eternatus, even when sealed or contained, may continue to accumulate the kind of energy that produced the catastrophes in the first place. There is no statement that the cycle is now permanently ended. This is one of the few mysteries in the series where the resolution feels deliberately incomplete. The previous Darkest Day was answered, and the current one is answered, and the next one is left as an open possibility. The region knows what it would do if it happened again. The weapons would be drawn, the heroes would step forward, and the work would be repeated. The next chapter is simply not the players to read in this game. And while we drift through these old shrines and these quiet kingdoms, gently lower the volume if it feels too loud, settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting tonight, and let the rest of these mysteries unfold without hurry. The next of them begins on a distant set of islands, where the sky itself has been changed by a Pokémon that no one fully understands. In the Alola region, on a tall mountain at the spiritual center of one of the islands, there is a Pokémon called Necrozma that appears in the late stages of the regional story. Necrozma is described as a being made of light, or more precisely, as a being that consumes light, drawing it in from sources around it to sustain its own form. The Pokédex entries describe it as having lost something long ago, and the loss is said to be what drives its current behavior. The Pokémon is connected to two larger legendary creatures of the islands, one associated with the sun and one with the moon. Necrozma is described as the form that those two larger creatures both originally were, before some ancient event split it apart and left only fragments behind. The version of Necrozma that the player encounters in the late game is what remains of the original, diminished and hungry. When Necrozma reaches a particular form, by combining with one of the two larger legendaries, it temporarily steals the light from the islands, plunging the region into a dim, shadowed twilight. The skies darken, the buildings cast long, uncertain shadows, and the Pokémon that normally move freely through the islands become subdued. The player must intervene, restore the light, and either capture or defeat Necrozma in the process. The mystery is what Necrozma was before the splitting. The lore suggests an original form, complete and powerful, that existed in some distant era and was broken apart for reasons that the games do not specify. Some entries hint that the original Necrozma was visited by people from another world, that the splitting was performed by them, and that the current state of Necrozma is the long aftermath of a betrayal. The exact narrative is never settled. This is a mystery that rewards players who enjoy piecing together fragments. The references to Necrozma's original state are scattered across multiple games, multiple entries, multiple side characters, and multiple side stories. The complete picture is never assembled by any single character or text within the games themselves. The picture is assembled, if at all, in the player's own memory of all the small mentions across many years of playing. Back in the central Hoenn region, in a special sequence of events added to the remakes of the original games, there is a longer story called the Delta episode that the player can access after the main story concludes. The episode involves a young trainer who has been studying meteors and who has discovered that a particularly large one is on a collision course with the region. The trainer asks the player for help in preventing the impact. The events of the episode take the player to several locations across the region, including the Sky Pillar, the Sotopolis Crater, and a small space facility in Moss Deep. The trainer believes that the only way to deflect the meteor is to summon Rayquaza, the dragon from the top of the Sky Pillar, and to use it to leap into space and intercept the falling object directly. The plan succeeds, the meteor is deflected, and the region is saved. What makes this story a mystery is the implication beneath it. The trainer mentions in passing that the meteor that formed Sotopolis long ago is connected in some way the games never fully explain to the meteor that is currently on a collision course. The implication is that the falling objects are not random, that someone or something is sending them, and that the region has been a target for these impacts for a very long time. The character who suggests this is a serious researcher, and the suggestion is delivered without emphasis, as if it were merely speculation. The series has never followed up on the speculation. The meteors that have fallen and that almost fell are simply meteors, the events around them resolved, the region intact, the source of their trajectories left unexamined. This is one of the few mysteries in the series that opens up a possibility larger than the world the games normally describe. If the meteors are being sent, then someone is sending them. The someone is not identified. The reason is not explored. The implication hangs in the dialogue of a single optional episode, and most players play through it without realizing how large a question they have just been asked to set aside. In the busy modern setting of the Unova region, in the wide cities along the coast, there is a particular street in Castelia City where a small character occasionally speaks to the player. The character is a young man dressed in dark clothing, standing on a corner that most players walk past without paying attention. If the player engages him in conversation at the right time of day, he describes a voice he has heard in the city, a voice that does not belong to any of the Pokémon or people he has met. The voice, as he describes it, calls his name from the buildings around him. It does not come from any particular window or doorway. It seems to drift through the streets, audible only intermittently and only to him. He is uncertain whether he is hallucinating, whether the voice is real, or whether someone is playing a strange and elaborate trick. The young man tells the player about his experience and then walks away. He does not appear in any further events. The voice he describes is never connected to any Pokémon, any character, or any later story. The encounter is one short conversation in a long city, easy to miss, and the implications of it are left entirely unexplored. Some players have speculated that the voice he hears is connected to one of the ghost-type Pokémon that live in the region. Others have speculated that it is a remnant of an older inhabitant of the city, dating from when Castelia was smaller and quieter. Still others have speculated that the voice is simply a private experience, unconnected to anything larger, and that the young man's story is meant to suggest the way ordinary people in the Pokemon world have ordinary mysteries of their own. The series never returns to this scene. The corner remains. The buildings remain. The young man may or may not still be there on a future visit, and if he is, he may or may not tell the same story. The conversation is one of the smallest mysteries in the games, and one of the easiest to walk past, and one of the most quietly haunting if it happens to catch the player at the right moment. Across the same region, on a long bridge connecting two cities, there is a section of railing where the player can sometimes see a strange figure standing alone. The figure is a trainer, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and they do not initiate any conversation. If the player approaches them, they say only a few words about the view, about the bridge, about the fact that they have been standing there for a long time, waiting for something or someone. The character does not battle. The character does not give the player any items. The character does not appear on the bridge every time the player visits. There are conditions, possibly related to the time of day, the weather, or other variables the games have not made transparent, that determine whether the character is present. Some players have seen the trainer many times, others have never seen them at all. The implication is that this character may not be entirely alive. The old-fashioned clothing, the long wait, the way the conversation ends without resolution, all of it suggests a kind of ghost story without ever using the word. The bridge has a long history, the region has many old stories, and the trainer at the railing is perhaps one of those stories made briefly visible to the players who happen to walk by at the right moment. The mystery is who the trainer was. The mystery is what they were waiting for. The mystery is whether the wait has ended in some sense, or whether it continues, and whether the bridge has been the same kind of quiet meeting place for many people over many years. The character does not say. The bridge does not say. The next time the player walks across, the trainer is sometimes there and sometimes not, and the story remains exactly as half-told as it was the first time. In the same region, deep in the basement of a particular building, in the route that leads toward the League, there is a small set of photographs displayed on a wall. The photographs are old, faded, and show people the player will not recognize. The descriptions next to them mention that the building has been used for many purposes over the years, that the photographs were left behind by previous occupants, and that the current caretakers have chosen to display them rather than throw them away. One of the photographs shows a group of trainers from many generations ago. The styles of clothing are different from anything modern. The equipment they carry is unrecognizable, and the Pokémon visible in the background of the picture are not always the same as the Pokémon currently found in the surrounding region. The implication is that the region's roster has shifted over time, that certain species were once common in places where they are now rare, and that the photographic record preserves evidence of a different, older ecology. The series does not explain the changes. The Pokémon visible in the old photographs may have migrated, may have gone extinct, or may simply have become rare enough that the player will not encounter them on the standard routes. The photographs themselves are a kind of quiet archive, available to any player who walks down to the basement and pauses to look. The mystery here is the depth of the ecological history that the photographs imply. The current games show us a snapshot of the world at one particular moment. The photographs suggest that the world has had many moments before this one, with different distributions of species, different patterns of population, different relationships between Pokémon and the places they live. The complete history of those changes is not given. The photographs are a single quiet hint that the history exists. This is the kind of detail that rewards slow exploration. The basement is optional. The photographs are background. The descriptions next to them are short. A player who rushes through the building will not notice them, and a player who lingers will find a small set of questions that the rest of the game will never answer. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the music of the original Lavender Town in the earliest version of the Kanto games. The melody used in the town and inside Pokémon Tower is thinner and stranger than the music used elsewhere in the soundtrack. It uses fewer instruments, sits in a higher register than the surrounding tracks, and has a structure that some players have described as unsettling without being able to say exactly why. Around this music, over the years, a series of rumors developed that the series has never confirmed and never denied. The rumors involved unusual frequencies, hidden patterns, and suggestions that the music had been altered in later releases of the game to be less distressing for younger players. Some of these rumors expanded into elaborate stories that became more famous than the music itself. What is true, and what the series has implicitly accepted, is that the music of Lavender Town in the original Kanto game was deliberately designed to feel different from the rest of the soundtrack. The thinness, the high register, the structure, all of these were choices made to evoke the atmosphere of a graveyard town built around a tower of ghosts. The choice was successful, and the music has become one of the most distinctive pieces in the entire series. The mystery around the music is what it does to listeners. Some find it eerie, some find it sad, some find it merely strange. The variation in responses is part of why the music has accumulated so many legends around it over the years. The piece does not behave like ordinary game music, and the not behaving has invited interpretation. This is one of the rare cases where the mystery is not inside the game world, but inside the experience of playing the game. The music does what music does, and the players respond as they respond, and the legends grow in the space between the two. The town itself, when revisited in later remakes with updated music, feels different, and the difference is part of how players have come to understand what the original was doing. In the Sinnoh region, beneath the floor of a small ancient ruin, there is a single inscription on the wall that describes a long ago time when humans and Pokémon were not as separated as they are now. The inscription says that the two used to live closer, that they shared meals and conversations, and that the boundary between them was less firm. The inscription does not explain how the separation happened. It says only that it did, and that the time before is now remembered only in faded stories. This kind of statement appears in several places across the games, always in small inscriptions or in passing dialogue. The implication is consistent. In some distant past, humans and Pokémon were closer than they currently are. The transition between then and now is undocumented. Whatever separated them is treated as a fact rather than a story, and the story behind the fact is not told. The mystery is what this past actually looked like. We have only fragments. We have only inscriptions. We have only a few hinted images of people and Pokémon eating together, speaking together, sleeping in the same rooms. The fragments do not assemble into a coherent picture, and the lack of coherence is part of what makes the past feel genuinely distant rather than merely earlier. There is something gentle about this kind of mystery. The current world of the games is a world in which humans and Pokémon are friends, but also distinct, partners, but also separate. The implication that this was not always the case suggests that the current arrangement is the result of historical change rather than natural law. Things have been different. Things could be different again. The boundary is not permanent. This implication, threaded quietly through the inscriptions and the small dialogues, gives the series a kind of historical depth that most other adventure games never attempt. The world is not eternal. The relationships are not fixed. The friendships we see are part of a long ongoing story whose earlier chapters are now only fragments on the walls of small old rooms. Far above the Sinnoh region, in a small cave at the top of a mountain pass, there is a Pokémon called Cresselia that appears in dreams. Cresselia is described as a Pokémon associated with good dreams, with peace, and with the gentle settling of restless minds. In the regional story, a small child has been suffering from nightmares, and the player is sent to find Cresselia in order to help. The opposite of Cresselia, mentioned in the same set of legends, is a Pokémon called Darkrai. Darkrai is described as a Pokémon associated with nightmares, with restless sleep, and with the figures that sometimes appear in dreams that no one wanted. The two Pokémon are described as counterparts, and their territories are said to overlap in the dreaming lives of people across the region. The mystery of these two Pokémon is what they actually do. The games describe them as influencing dreams, as causing nightmares or providing relief from them, but the mechanism is never specified. The Pokémon themselves are not always physically present at the locations where their effects are felt. The implication is that they operate at a distance, that their influence reaches into the minds of people who may never see them, and that the boundary between waking life and dreaming life is not as solid as the games normally suggest. The series has implied in several places that dreams in the Pokémon world have a kind of reality that does not match the standard physics of waking life. There are places where dreams can be entered. There are mechanisms by which dreams can be shared. There are objects that hold dreams, the way ordinary objects hold water. Cresselia and Darkrai are positioned as something like gardeners or thieves of this dream territory. The mystery extends to what happens in dreams when people are not aware of it. If the two Pokémon are tending or disturbing dreams across the region, then the experience of sleeping in any town is partly an experience of being touched by their distant influence. The player's own character, presumably, also sleeps in this world, and presumably is also subject to the same processes. The story does not say what the player's character dreams about, and the silence is one of the gentlest unanswered questions in the series. In the original Johto region, and in a tall building at the heart of the city of Ecruteak, there is a famous tower that the player visits during the main story. The tower is called the Bell Tower in some versions, and the Tin Tower in others, and it is one of the two original great towers of the region. The other tower, across the street and to the north, is called the Burned Tower, and the name describes its condition exactly. The Burned Tower is a ruin. The roof collapsed long ago. The interior is mostly a single open space, filled with fallen beams and scorched wood. The fire that destroyed it is said to have been caused by a single bolt of lightning that struck during a terrible storm many decades or perhaps centuries ago. The fire spread quickly through the wooden structure, and the building was lost before it could be saved. According to the local stories, 3 Pokémon were inside the tower at the time of the fire. They were killed in the burning, and their bodies were left in the ruins as the storm cleared. Then, after the fire had passed, a Pokémon called Ho-Oh descended from the sky and resurrected the 3 of them. The 3 Pokémon emerged from the ruined tower transformed, given new bodies and new powers, and they ran away across the region and have continued to roam ever since. These 3 Pokémon are now legendary in the region, and players who pursue them spend many hours of game time tracking them through the routes. The Pokémon are sometimes called the legendary beasts, and their associations with thunder, fire, and water reflect the elements that touch them at the moment of the fire and the storm and the rain that followed. They are running monuments to a single moment of resurrection. The mystery of the burned tower is what the 3 Pokémon were before they were resurrected. The stories say that they were Pokémon already, but the games do not specify what species. The implication is that they were 3 ordinary creatures who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that the resurrection by Ho-Oh transformed them into something they had never been before. The original forms are never described. This is one of the most quietly poignant mysteries in the series. 3 creatures died, were given new lives by a rainbow Pokémon and have been running through the region ever since. They cannot return to what they were before because they no longer are those creatures. They are something else now, born from a fire and a storm and a moment of grace, and they carry that origin in the way they move and in the way they are always running. The tin tower across the street, by contrast, still stands. It is intact, the wood is preserved, and the upper floors can be climbed. At the top of the tower, Ho-Oh itself can be encountered, the same Pokémon that brought the three beasts back. The encounter with Ho-Oh at the top of the tower is treated as the culmination of a long arc that begins with the burned ruin across the street. The mystery here is what Ho-Oh waits for. The Pokémon is said to descend only when something important is happening, only when the world needs its presence in a particular way. Most of the time, Ho-Oh remains at the top of the tower, or somewhere in the clouds above the region, or in some other distant place. The descent is rare. The reasons for the descent are also rare, and the long quiet between descents is its own kind of question. The series has implied that Ho-Oh's appearances are timed to events the games do not fully explain. The bird arrives when a pure-hearted trainer climbs the tower. The bird also arrived when the three Pokémon died in the burning across the street. The pattern suggests that Ho-Oh responds to moments of significance, whether ceremonial or tragic, and that those moments are not predictable by ordinary means. There is something gentle and ancient about this idea. The world has a Pokémon that watches it from a high place, descends only rarely, and when it descends, something is allowed to happen that could not otherwise. The other towers across other regions, the rainbow that sometimes appears above other rooftops, all of these may be small echoes of the same kind of attention. Ho-Oh is not always present, but the implication is that Ho-Oh is always somewhere, waiting for the next moment that calls it down. In the same region, in a small forest behind a town near a lake, there is a Pokémon called Celebi that is associated with time. Celebi is said to be able to travel through time, moving freely between different eras of the region's history, appearing in moments when its presence might shape events for the better. The Pokémon is small, green, fairy-like in appearance, and gentle in nature. The mystery of Celebi is what its time travel actually does. The series treats it as a real ability rather than as a metaphor. Celebi can appear in the present, the past, and the future. It can carry travelers with it across these boundaries under certain conditions. It can change events in ways that ripple forward or backward through time. The implications of these abilities are vast, and the games never fully explore them. Several side stories in different generations have involved Celebi taking a particular character to a particular moment in the past. The events of those side stories suggest that history in the Pokémon world is not entirely fixed. There are points where Celebi's presence can alter the course of things, and the alteration changes what happens afterward. The full extent of these changes is left unclear. If we take Celebi's abilities seriously, then the history of the regions we have seen is not simply the history that happened. It is the history that resulted after Celebi's interventions, the version of events that Celebi either created or preserved. The past we know is one version of many possible pasts. The future we are building is one version of many possible futures. This is one of the most philosophically open mysteries in the series. The implications stretch far beyond a single game or a single region. They suggest a model of the world in which time is permeable, in which small green Pokémon move freely through it, and in which the events we participate in are participating in something larger that is not entirely visible from any single moment. In the deepest cave at the center of the Sinjo ruins, accessible only through a particular sequence of events involving Celebi, an ancient ritual can be performed that summons one of the three creation Pokémon. The ritual involves stone, time, and a long, quiet ceremony. The The site of the ruins is described as being on the boundary between two regions, and the rituals performed there are said to be very old. The mystery of the Sinjo ruins is what culture performed the rituals originally. The structure is clearly built, the walls are inscribed with deliberate patterns, and the floor is shaped for ceremony. But the people who built it are not the people who live in the surrounding region now. There are no current ceremonies. There are no current keepers. The ruins are simply there, waiting, and the rituals are reactivated only when the player visits with Celebi and the right items. The implication is that the people who once lived near the ruins knew more about the creation Pokémon than the current residents do. They knew the rituals, they knew the timing, they knew the relationship between the three Pokémon and the structures of the world. Whatever happened to those people, whatever caused them to leave or to forget, the ruins remain as a kind of testament to what they once knew. This is another version of the recurring shape we have seen many times. A site exists. A practice was performed there. The practice has been forgotten by the current generation. The site continues to wait, and the rituals can be reactivated by someone who knows enough to perform them. The continuity of the knowledge is fragile, dependent on individual travelers and individual moments of recognition. The Sinjo ruins are one of the few sites in the series where the player can directly participate in something that the original culture would have recognized. The summoning of the creation Pokémon with the right offerings is not the player's invention. It is something the ruins were built for. The player, by performing the ritual, becomes briefly a participant in a practice that predates the modern regions entirely. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at a small isolated cave in the eastern part of the Unova region, accessible only after the main story and only through a particular set of choices. Inside the cave, a Pokémon called Volcarona rests, and the surrounding chamber is uncomfortably warm. The Pokédex entries describe Volcarona as a Pokémon that once acted as a kind of artificial sun during ages when the world was cold, providing warmth and light to the regions that surrounded its cave. The implication is unusual. A single Pokémon, in some distant past, served as a heat source for an entire region. The world was cold, the people were struggling, and the warmth of Volcarona kept them alive. The cave where it now rests was once the center of a community that depended on its glow. The community is gone. The Pokémon remains. The mystery is what the world was like during the Cold Age. The series does not specify the time period, the extent of the cold, or the size of the community that depended on Volcarona's warmth. We are given the fact and very little else. The Cold Age is mentioned, the Pokémon's role is described, and the rest of the story is left to imagination. This kind of mythological detail gives the Pokémon world a sense of ecological history that operates on much longer timescales than the player's adventure. The current region is warm and populated and busy. The previous region was cold and depended on a Pokémon for survival. The shift from then to now is not described. The Pokémon waits in its cave, and the cave waits in the modern region, and the connection between the two is mostly absent from the current games. There is something humbling about meeting Volcarona for the first time and realizing what its old role was. The Pokémon is not just a fire and bug-type creature with strong stats. It is, in the lore, the reason a long-gone people survived a long-gone winter. The encounter feels small, and the implications behind it feel enormous, and the gap between the two is part of why the moment lingers. In the small Kanto region, on a route just south of a city, there is a small dark forest that the player can wander into briefly during the main story. The forest is not a major location. There are no important characters inside. There are no required events. The player can pass through quickly without missing anything significant. But the forest has been the source of a quiet rumor for many years, related to a sprite that appears in some early prototypes of the game. The sprite is of a Pokémon that does not exist in the final version of the games. It looks something like a ghost, something like a tree, and something like a small humanoid figure. It was apparently considered for inclusion during development, given a place in the early data, and then removed before release. The reasons for the removal are not officially documented, and the prototype data has only become visible through the kind of careful examination that fans have performed over many years. The mystery is not the Pokémon itself, which never made it into the games and exists only as a small piece of cut content. The mystery is the impression that the forest in the final game still feels like a place that was meant to have something in it. The atmosphere is darker than the roots around it. The encounter rates suggest emptiness. The trees grow in patterns that look like they were placed to surround something that is no longer there. This is a different kind of mystery than the ones we have looked at so far. It is a mystery of absence, of a place that was prepared for an inhabitant and then left without one. The inhabitant exists only in the development files. The place in the final game still carries the shape of what was supposed to be there. The series has produced many places like this over the years, places that hold the impressions of cut content, even after the cut content itself has been removed. Players sensitive to atmosphere can sometimes feel these places without knowing the history. The route feels off. The forest feels empty. The town feels too quiet. The original reasons for these feelings are sometimes in the development records, and sometimes nowhere at all. In the eastern Huan region, on a small abandoned ship anchored off the coast, there is a series of cabins the player can explore. The ship is empty. The crew is gone. The cabins are full of small details, half-finished journals, abandoned meals, and one room in particular where a child appears to be standing alone in the darkness. The child does not speak. The player can interact, but the responses are minimal. The story of the ship is partially explained through the journals. The vessel was a passenger ship that ran into trouble at sea. The passengers had to evacuate. Some were saved, and some were not. The child in the cabin is, according to the most common interpretation, one of the ones who was not, and the silence of their interaction is part of why the encounter has stayed with players for so long. The ship is fully optional. There is no required event there. There is no character who insists on the visit. The player wanders aboard out of curiosity, walks the corridors at their own pace, and encounters the child only if they happen to enter the right cabin. The encounter ends without resolution, and the player leaves the ship with the same questions they brought aboard. The mystery is the rest of the passengers. The journals mention many people. The ship has many cabins. The cabins are mostly empty. The few that contain anything contain very little, and the player can construct a partial picture from the fragments, but never a complete one. The events that ended the ship's journey are sketched lightly, and the consequences are visible only in the empty spaces of the rooms. This is the kind of side area that the series builds carefully and then leaves alone. There is no later moment that returns to the ship. There is no character who explains what happened. The ship simply exists, available for those who want to explore it, and the empty cabins continue to hold the small details of a story that no one is going to tell completely. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at a particular cave in the moss-deep area, where a space center sits on the edge of the city. The center is one of the few places in the games where the existence of space travel is treated as a current event rather than a distant possibility. Scientists work inside the building. Rockets are visible on the launch pads. The implication is that the Pokémon world has reached into space in ways that the rest of the regions rarely discuss. The Space Center is connected to several of the larger mysteries we have already touched on. The meteor that nearly hit the region in the Delta episode required understanding of orbital mechanics to deflect. The Pokémon Deoxys, which appears on Birth Island, is said to have originated from space. The rockets at the center are described as having been used for missions related to these and other events. The center is a hub of activity, and the activity touches on questions much larger than the local region. The mystery is what else the Space Center has done. The games show us a few events, but the building exists permanently, and the rockets continue to be prepared and launched on schedules the player does not see. There may be many missions whose results are not described. There may be many discoveries that are not part of the main story. The implication is that the Pokémon world is more technologically advanced than the games usually emphasize. The standard adventure focuses on small towns, on routes between cities, on Pokémon trainers who walk from one place to another. The Space Center is a reminder that the same world contains scientists who are sending rockets into orbit, and that the two layers of the world coexist without much comment. This is the kind of mystery that grows the more you think about it. If space travel exists in the Pokémon world, then the boundaries of the world are much larger than the regional maps suggest. The events on Birth Island, the meteors, the visits from Ultra Beasts, all of them connect to a layer of reality that the games rarely explore directly. The Space Center sits in a small city on a small island, and the silence around what it has done is enormous. In the same region, near a different coastal town, there is a smaller research facility focused on the ocean rather than on the sky. The facility studies the deepest parts of the sea, sending submarines down to depths that ordinary divers cannot reach. The events of the main story involve a submarine being stolen by antagonists, used to reach an underwater cave, and ultimately recovered after the conflict is resolved. The submarine returns to the facility, and the research continues. The mystery is what the deeper research has found. The facility has been operating for years before the events of the player's adventure. The submarines have been making trips for a long time. The records of those trips are not displayed to the player. The implication is that there are things in the deep ocean that the researchers know about and that the rest of the region does not. The Pokémon associated with the deeper ocean include some of the rarest in the series. There are creatures that live at pressures and temperatures that should not support life. There are sites underwater that the player can briefly visit but cannot fully explore. The research facility has presumably documented many of these things over the years, and the documentation is not part of any in-game readable text. This is another case of implied depth without explicit detail. The research is happening. The discoveries are accumulating. The full story is not being shown to the player. The player visits the facility once or twice, learns enough to advance the main story, and then moves on. The deeper questions about what lives in the deep ocean and what the researchers have learned about it remain in the background, available only to anyone curious enough to wonder. In the same coastal town, beside the research facility, there is a small graveyard where sailors and divers have been buried. The graveyard is not on the main path of the player's adventure. It is a small side area, easy to miss, and the markers on the graves are simple stones with short inscriptions. The inscriptions describe people who were lost at sea, people who never returned from expeditions, people whose bodies were never recovered for proper burial elsewhere. The mystery of the graveyard is the implication of the absences. The stones mark people who died, but in many cases the markers are placed without bodies beneath them. The deaths happened somewhere out in the water. The bodies are still there, somewhere, deep enough that no one will ever find them. The graveyard is a memorial for the missing, rather than a resting place for the buried. The series treats this kind of detail with a quiet seriousness that most adventure games do not attempt. The graveyard is a real graveyard, and the deaths are treated as real deaths, and the lack of bodies is treated as a real absence. The player can walk through the markers, read the names, and feel the weight of the small histories without any character forcing the feeling into the foreground. This is a recurring shape in the series. The world has many places where death is acknowledged gently and without ceremony. The Pokémon Tower in Kanto is one example. The Mount Pyre graveyard in Hoenn is another. The small markers near the research facility are smaller and quieter than either of those, but they belong to the same set of places where the games allow loss to exist as a real part of the world. The mystery is the rest of the lost. The sea is vast. The number of people who have disappeared into it is presumably much larger than the small graveyard suggests. The names on the stones are only the ones whose families had something to mourn. The other names, the ones whose families never knew where they had gone, are not written anywhere. The graveyard is a small visible piece of a much larger silence. If you continue along the coast of the same region, you eventually reach a small abandoned dock where an old fisherman sometimes sits. The fisherman is friendly and willing to talk, and his stories are full of the kind of detail that suggests a long life spent on the water. He mentions Pokémon he has seen that no one else in the region has reported. He mentions waves and currents that have changed over the years. He mentions places along the coast where his nets used to come back full and where they now come back empty. The mystery of the fisherman is not his identity. The mystery is the world he describes. His stories suggest an ocean that has been changing in ways the games do not directly track. Populations of Pokémon have shifted. The behaviors of certain species have changed. The water itself, according to him, is not exactly what it used to be. The series does not confirm or deny the fisherman's observations. He is one character among many, and his stories are easily missed by players who do not engage in conversation with him. The information he offers is the kind that anyone could choose to disregard, but the consistency of his observations, repeated across multiple visits and multiple games in some cases, suggests that the world is genuinely changing in the way he describes. This is one of the smaller and most realistic mysteries in the series. The Pokémon world, like the real world, has long-term ecological changes that ordinary residents notice but cannot fully explain. The fisherman watches the water year after year, and the water is not the same water it was when he started. The reasons for the change are not given. The change itself is acknowledged through his stories, and the rest is left for anyone listening to consider. In the central region of Sinnoh, on a route between two cities, there is a small open field where a young trainer stands looking up at the sky. The trainer is not a battle opponent. The trainer is simply standing there, and if the player approaches, the trainer says only a few words about something they saw in the clouds a few minutes earlier. The something is not described in detail. It was large, it was moving, and it disappeared before the trainer could be sure of what they were looking at. The trainer's brief description is one of many small references in the games to flying Pokémon being seen at the edges of perception. People mention having seen things. The things are never confirmed. The flying Pokémon may have been ordinary species, may have been rare ones, or may have been creatures that no one has ever named. The descriptions are brief, and the observations are uncertain. The mystery is what is actually flying in the skies of the regions. The games show us many flying-type Pokémon, but they also imply that the skies contain more than what the player encounters directly. The trainer on the route is one small voice, among many suggesting that the air above the regions has things in it that no one has fully cataloged. The cataloging may be impossible. The things may be too quick and too rare, too high to be captured for study. This is another version of the recurring pattern. The world contains more than the maps show, and the more is acknowledged through small voices in small places. The trainer in the field does not insist on the existence of the thing they saw. They just mention it briefly, and then returned to looking at the clouds. Whether the thing was real, whether it was something significant, whether it will ever be seen again, all of these are questions the games leave alone. In a small office in the central city of the Kalos region, a researcher describes a project he has been working on related to a Pokémon called Mewtwo. The researcher is not the original creator of Mewtwo. He is a different scientist, working in a different city, in a different region, on a project that has parallels to the original creation, but is also distinct from it. The exact nature of his project is not fully described in the standard dialogue. The implication is that Mewtwo's existence in the Kanto region many years earlier set a precedent. Other scientists in other places began trying to replicate the work. The original Pokémon Mansion was destroyed long ago, but the records that survived have apparently been studied by people in other regions. The Kalos researcher is part of a long aftermath of the original project. The mystery is what the new projects have produced. The games imply that there are creatures related to Mewtwo in the Kalos region, that some of them have been encountered briefly in side events, and that the full scope of the work has not been described to the player. The Pokémon that resulted from the new projects may be similar to Mewtwo, may be very different, or may be entirely new beings whose connection to the original work is only partial. This is one of the deeper continuities in the series. The original Pokémon Mansion in Kanto, the journal entries about the creation of Mewtwo, the long aftermath of that creation, all of it has continued to ripple outward into other regions and other generations of games. The events of the original project are not over. They are simply happening elsewhere now, in offices the player only briefly visits, in research the player only briefly hears about. The mystery here is what kind of beings exist now that would not have existed without the original Pokémon Mansion. The world has been changed by the work of a single research team many years ago, and the change continues to spread. The full picture of that change is not given. The fragments are scattered across regions and generations, and the careful player can assemble parts of the picture, but the complete picture remains out of reach. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the small Pokémon called Phione, which is sometimes encountered in the early aquatic roots of certain regions. Phione is described as the offspring of a larger Pokémon called Manaphy, but the relationship between the two is unusual in several ways. Phione resembles Manaphy in many respects, but it is smaller, less powerful, and less developed in its abilities. The implication is that Phione is something between an offspring and an incomplete version of the larger Pokémon. The mystery is what Manaphy actually is. The games describe it as a guardian of the sea, as a Pokémon with significant power over water-based phenomena, and as a creature that lays eggs that produce Phione rather than more Manaphy. The lack of direct reproduction between the same species suggests that Manaphy is, in some sense, unique. There is only one of it at a time. The offspring are something less. The lore implies that Manaphy is involved in the broader balance of the oceans, similar in some ways to other guardian Pokémon in other regions. The connection between Manaphy and the older legendary Pokémon Kyogre, which controls the seas more directly, is not specified. The two may be related, may be cooperating, may be working at different scales of the same general task, or may be entirely independent. The mystery extends to where Manaphy spends most of its time. The Pokémon is encountered rarely in specific events, and its standard location is described as the deepest parts of the ocean. The ordinary regions never see it. The standard maps do not include its territory. The player meets Manaphy through events that are designed to be exceptional, and the rest of its life happens somewhere far below the visible surface of the world. This pattern, where a Pokémon is described as important to the balance of the world but is rarely seen, recurs throughout the series. The implication is that the world is held together by a network of these rare creatures. each tending to their part of the natural systems, mostly invisible to ordinary travelers. The player meets some of them in the course of their adventure. Most of them are never met by anyone. In the southern part of the Galar region, in a small, wild area dominated by tall grass and gentle hills, there is a stone monument that the player can examine. The monument is old, the inscriptions are weathered, and the description of it suggests that it was placed long ago to mark a particular event. The event involved a battle, and the battle was between a king and something else, and the something else is not named on the stone. The implication, when read alongside the other references to the kingdom of Calyrex and the Darkest Day, is that the region has had several major confrontations in its past. The kings ruled and stepped back. The catastrophes came and were stopped. The battles were fought and were marked with monuments. The history is fragmented across many small sites. The mystery is the something else. The monument does not name it, and no other text in the games describes it directly. There are hints that it may have been a Pokémon, may have been a person, may have been some force or phenomenon that does not fit cleanly into either category. The vagueness is deliberate. The story is preserved enough to be remembered, but not enough to be fully understood. This kind of half-recorded history fits the general pattern we have seen across regions. The past is present in monuments, but the monuments are not detailed. They mark events without explaining them. The travelers who visit the monuments learn that something happened, learn approximately when, and learn approximately where, but do not learn what. The texture of this kind of history feels real in a way that more detailed lore sometimes does not. Real historical sites in the actual world are often like this. Monuments mark events that were significant to the people who built them, and the events fade from memory while the monuments remain. The Pokémon games reproduce this texture, and the result is a world that feels old in a believable way. In the same region, on a different route, there is a small chapel that the player can enter. Inside the chapel, a single character stands and offers a brief prayer when the player approaches. The prayer is for the safety of those who travel, for the gentleness of the weather, and for the continued peace of the region. The character does not give any items. The character does not battle. The character simply prays and waits for the player to leave. The mystery is the religion implied by the chapel. The Pokémon games have rarely been explicit about religious practice, but small details accumulate across the regions. There are shrines and prayers and offerings and altars. There are characters who speak about reverence for ancient Pokémon. There are festivals that have ritual elements. The complete picture of religious life in the Pokémon world is never assembled, but the fragments suggest that such life exists. The chapel is a small piece of this larger pattern. The prayer the character offers is gentle and ordinary. The chapel itself is modest, the building unremarkable, the location easy to miss. But the existence of the chapel implies that the people of the region pray, and that they pray for the same kinds of things that people pray for in other places. The continuity between the Pokémon world and ordinary human concerns is quietly present. This is one of the most grounded kinds of detail in the series. The chapel is not magical. The prayer does not summon anything. The character is not a hidden boss. The whole encounter is simply a quiet acknowledgement that people in the Pokémon world live ordinary lives that include moments of quiet faith. The mystery is not what they believe specifically. The mystery is the depth of the daily life the series gestures towards without depicting directly. In the original Johto region, near the city of Cherry Grove, there is a small route that the player walks early in their adventure. The route is unremarkable in most ways, but at a particular point along it, a single character stands looking out toward the sea. The character is a child, and the child says they have been waiting for someone who left a long time ago. They do not know when the person will return. The mystery is whom the child is waiting for. The dialogue does not specify. The child does not have a name for the person, or if they do not share it. The waiting has been long enough that the child has grown used to it, and the standing on the route has become a habit rather than an active search. The character offers no hints about whether the person will ever come back. The series does not return to this scene. The child remains on the route, day after day, looking at the sea. The person they are waiting for may have died, may have moved away permanently, may have simply forgotten the appointment, or may genuinely be on their way back at some unspecified future moment. The waiting continues regardless of the outcome. This is one of the smallest and gentlest mysteries in the series. The child does not need anything from the player. The waiting does not interfere with the main story. The encounter is brief and easy to walk past. But the image of a small figure looking at the sea day after day for someone who may never come stays with the players who notice it. The series is full of these small, unresolved waits. There are characters in many regions who are waiting for someone, looking for someone, hoping for someone. The waits are rarely resolved. The hopes are rarely fulfilled. The series allows the suspended moments to remain suspended, and the player carries the awareness of them as they continue with their own larger adventure. In a small mountain pass in the Hoenn region, there is a single old man sitting beside the road. The man does not battle, and does not give the player items, and does not offer any clues about the main story. He sits quietly, and if the player engages him, tells them a long story about a Pokémon he raised many years ago. The Pokémon has passed on. The story is mostly about the time they spent together, the routes they walked, the small habits they developed. The story is unusually long for a side character in a Pokémon game. The man speaks across multiple dialogue boxes, taking the player through the years of his life with this Pokémon, describing the Pokémon's preferences and quirks and small kindnesses. The story does not end with a moral or a quest or a reward. It ends with the man simply sitting quietly again, looking at the road, having said what he wanted to say. The mystery is who he was telling the story for. The player walks up to him and the story unfolds, but the man does not appear to need the player to do anything with it. The story is being told because it needs to be told, and the player is simply the one who has stopped to listen. The relationship with the Pokémon is over, but the act of describing it continues, and the description seems to be its own kind of preservation. The series rarely allows characters this much space. Most NPCs deliver a short line and step aside. The old man on the pass is given a longer moment, and the choice to give him that longer moment is meaningful. The series is saying quietly that not every story in the world is part of the main quest. Some stories exist only to be told, and the listener is incidental. The mystery, in a deeper sense, is how many other stories like this are in the world. The old man tells his story to the player, but he presumably tells it to other travelers who pass by, and presumably has been telling versions of it for years. The act of remembering, of speaking aloud, is one of the ways the world holds on to what it has lost. The Pokémon games rarely make this explicit, but the old man on the pass quietly demonstrates it. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the small Pokémon called Mimikyu, which lives in the Alola region and which has built itself a disguise. Mimikyu wears a small cloth costume designed to look like the most popular Pokémon in the world, Pikachu. The costume is uneven, hand-stitched, and somewhat unsettling in its imperfection. The face drawn on the cloth is a child's drawing of the face it is trying to imitate, and the body beneath the costume is hidden from view. The Pokédex entries for Mimikyu suggest that the costume was made by the Pokémon itself, that the goal was to become loved by people who already loved Pikachu, and that the disguise has been worn for so long that the original body underneath has become something even Mimikyu does not show. There is a quiet sadness in the description. The Pokemon wants to be loved, and it has constructed a costume in the shape of love it has observed elsewhere. The mystery is what is actually under the costume. The Pokédex entries hint that anyone who has seen the true body of a Mimikyu has either died or fled in terror. The descriptions are not detailed enough to confirm what is beneath. The Pokémon is treated as something whose appearance cannot be revealed without consequence, and the costume is treated as a kind of protection both for Mimikyu and for the people around it. This is one of the more contemporary mysteries in the series. Mimikyu is a recent addition to the Pokémon roster, and its design plays directly with the long history of the franchise. The costume is a costume of the most iconic Pokémon ever created. The act of imitation is also an act of yearning. The mystery of the body underneath is partly a mystery and partly a warning. The series has been careful not to fully reveal what is under the costume. Even in promotional materials, even in fan-facing illustrations, even in the games themselves, the true form is kept hidden. The hiding is part of the design. The mystery is meant to remain unsolved, and the Pokemon's identity is meant to live in the costume rather than beneath it. In the Galar region, far in the wild area, there is a particular set of standing stones arranged in a circle on a hillside. The stones are weathered, the inscriptions are faded, and no current characters in the region claim responsibility for their placement. The circle is a small one, fitting perhaps a dozen people inside, and the stones themselves stand about as tall as a person. The arrangement suggests deliberate construction, but the original purpose is not described. Players who visit the stones at certain times have reported brief encounters with Pokémon that do not appear elsewhere in the region. The encounters are not consistent. They happen during certain weather conditions, certain times of day, and possibly only after the player has fulfilled certain other conditions in the main story. The Pokémon that appear are sometimes rare, sometimes legendary, and sometimes simply unusual variations of more common species. The mystery is what the stones are doing. They appear to be a kind of focal point for the surrounding ecology, drawing in certain Pokémon under certain conditions. The mechanism is not explained. The original builders are not named. The choice to place the stones in this specific arrangement at this specific location is treated as something the modern characters have inherited rather than something they understand. This kind of inherited mystery is one of the most common patterns in the series. The current generation of people in the world walks past structures they did not build, uses paths they did not lay, and lives near monuments whose meanings have been forgotten. The Pokémon games quietly insist that this is what the world looks like. The past is everywhere, and the present is partial, and the connection between the two is mostly missing. The stones on the hillside continue to stand. The Pokémon continue to appear when the conditions are right. The mystery of who placed the stones and why they were placed remains unsolved, and the lack of resolution is part of why the place has the atmosphere it does. The hillside is not a tourist attraction. It is a quiet remnant, and the players who find it find something that was waiting for them to notice. In the Sinnoh region, in the foggy woods west of the central mountain, there is a small house occupied by an old artist. The artist paints landscapes of the region, and the paintings are displayed on the walls of the house. If the player examines the paintings carefully, they notice that some of them show places that do not exist on the current map of the region. The places have features that no current location matches. The buildings are different. The shapes of the hills are wrong. The Pokémon in the foregrounds are species that no longer live in the area. The artist explains that the paintings are based on memories from his childhood, from a time when the region looked different than it does now. Some of the changes are due to construction. Some are due to migration of Pokémon populations. Some are due to events the artist cannot fully describe. He paints what he remembers, and he acknowledges that some of his memories may not match the present in every detail. The mystery is what the region used to look like. The artist's paintings are the most direct visual evidence the games offer of the region's deeper past. The paintings are not labeled with dates, the exact periods of the artist's memories are not specified, but the cumulative impression is that the region has changed substantially within the artist's own lifetime, and that the changes are larger than ordinary urban development would explain. The series allows this kind of personal history to coexist with the larger official history without forcing reconciliation. The legends about the creation Pokémon and the deep past are one layer. The artist's memories of his childhood are another. The current map of the region is a third. The three layers do not fully match, and the mismatches are part of how the region feels real. The artist offers some of his paintings as gifts. The player can take them away and add them to the small museums in the player's own home if the game supports it. The paintings become part of the player's permanent record of the region, a small private archive of what the region used to be, carried forward by the player and the artist together. In the original Hoenn region, on a small island off the eastern coast, there is a single tree that has been growing for a very long time. The tree is much larger than the others around it. The leaves are a slightly different color, and the soil around its base is described as unusually warm. The tree has been the subject of local legend for generations. Children dare each other to climb it. Travelers stop to admire it. No one has ever satisfactorily explained why this particular tree has grown to such an unusual size. The Pokédex entries for the local grass-type Pokémon sometimes mention this tree as a gathering point. Migrations of certain species are said to pass through the tree's vicinity. Certain rare Pokémon are described as having been seen resting in its branches. The tree appears in multiple entries, treated as a known landmark rather than a mystery. The mystery, of course, is why the tree is what it is. The series does not explain the warmth in the soil. The series does not explain the unusual color of the leaves. The series does not explain why so many migrating Pokémon pause there. The tree is simply there, larger and warmer and more significant than the trees around it, and the explanations are left to local rumor. This kind of mystery operates at a very small scale. The tree is one object in one corner of one region. The questions it raises are modest, but the cumulative effect of many small unexplained features across the regions is significant. The world is full of these small unexplained things. Each one is minor on its own. Together, they suggest a world that is full of details no single character has ever fully cataloged. The tree continues to grow. The migrations continue to pass through. The children continue to dare each other to climb. The mystery continues to wait, in the way many of the smaller mysteries wait, for a curious traveler who notices it and pauses long enough to ask why. In the Kalos region, in a quiet town near the western coast, there is a small flower shop run by an elderly woman. The shop sells various ordinary flowers, but on a small shelf at the back of the room, the woman keeps a single dried flower under a glass dome. The flower is unusual. The petals are a color that does not match any species the player can find growing in the wild. The shape is slightly off, as if the flower had grown in conditions that no longer exist. The woman explains as that the flower came from her grandmother, who had received it from her own grandmother, and that the original source was a meadow that no longer exists. The meadow was paved over, or flooded, or simply lost to the changes of time, and the flower under the glass is one of the few remaining specimens of a plant that no longer grows anywhere in the region. The mystery is what else has been lost in the same way. The flower is one small piece of evidence that the region used to support species that are no longer present. The number of species that have disappeared without leaving even a single dried specimen behind is presumably much larger. The shop has one flower. The world has had many flowers that no one preserved. This is another version of the recurring pattern. The world is a continuing accumulation of small losses, and the losses are mostly invisible. The current ecology of a region is a snapshot of one moment in a long sequence of moments. The previous moments contained things the current moment does not. The previous moments are not recoverable, and the only evidence we have of them is the small artifacts that someone happened to save. The woman offers to show the player other small items she has inherited. There are seeds, dried petals, a single carved button, a piece of cloth from a dress no one wears anymore. Each item is one fragment of a longer story, and the longer story is mostly missing, and the woman keeps the fragments, because keeping them is one of the few things she can do for the past she remembers. In the original Unova region, in the eastern part of the map, there is a tall museum building that the player can visit. The museum contains fossils, ancient artifacts, and a series of exhibits about the deep history of the region. Most of the exhibits are educational and gentle. One exhibit in a back corner of a side room is different. It displays a single artifact that the curator describes as having been found in a place that is no longer on any map. The artifact is a small carved object, perhaps the size of a fist, made of a material that no current craftsman has been able to identify. The curator explains that the place where it was found was a small valley in the central highlands of the region. The valley was studied briefly by an expedition many years ago, and then the path to it was lost. Subsequent expeditions could not find the valley again. The artifact remained in the museum, but the place it came from could not be revisited. The mystery is whether the valley still exists. The curator suggests several possibilities. Perhaps the geography of the highlands changed enough that the valley is no longer recognizable. Perhaps the original expedition's records were inaccurate, and the valley is in a slightly different location than the maps suggested. Perhaps the valley was somehow concealed deliberately by people who did not want it to be found, and the concealment has held. The series does not return to this artifact. The valley does not become a location the player can visit. The mystery exists in a single exhibit, in a single museum, and the curator's description is the only information the player receives. The implications, however, are significant. The world contains places that have been seen once and then lost. The losing is not metaphorical. It is geographical and practical and final. The artifact remains in the exhibit case. The curator continues to maintain the display. Other visitors come and go, glancing at the small object and reading the label and moving on to the next room. The mystery persists, untouched by the foot traffic, and the valley remains as lost as it has been for as long as the museum has stood. In the deeper part of the Sinnoh region, in a small underground network connected to several mining towns, there is a system of tunnels that miners use to extract ores and gems. The tunnels are extensive, and players can dig through walls in certain rooms to recover small treasures. The mining itself is a side activity, often pursued for relaxation rather than for any major reward. In one particular tunnel, deep beneath the surface, there is a small chamber that does not appear to have been excavated by the modern miners. The walls are too smooth, the floor is too even. The chamber has the appearance of something that was built rather than dug, and the construction is older than any of the surrounding mine work. The mystery is who built the chamber. The current miners do not know. The historical records do not include any reference to underground construction in this location. The chamber's purpose is unclear. The entry points are not in obvious places, and the small details of the construction suggest skills that the current generation of miners does not possess. The series implies, gently, that there have been people living in the region for longer than the current civilization has been there. The chamber is one piece of evidence. The ruins in other locations are more evidence. The inscriptions in older languages are still more. The picture that emerges is of a region whose modern surface sits on top of layers and layers of older habitation, and the deeper layers are mostly invisible to ordinary residents. The chamber continues to be passed through by miners who barely notice it. The walls remain smooth. The floor remains even. The construction continues to wait for someone to recognize what they are looking at, and the recognition does not come from any of the standard characters in the standard story. In the Galar region, at the edge of one of the largest forests, there is a single old hunter who has lived in the woods for most of his life. The hunter does not battle the player and does not give items. He simply tells the player about the forest, about the Pokémon that live in it, about the changes he has seen across his many years of walking under the trees. Some of his observations match the standard ecology that the games describe. Some of them do not. He mentions, for example, a creature he saw deep in the forest several decades ago that has not been seen by anyone since. He describes the creature briefly in the kind of detail that a hunter would use, focusing on size and movement rather than on color or pattern. The creature does not match any species in the current Pokédex. The hunter is not certain whether what he saw was a real Pokémon, an unusual variation of a known species, or something else entirely. The series does not confirm what he saw. The hunter is one character with one memory of one moment many years ago. There is no follow-up event in which the creature is rediscovered. There is no subsequent expedition that confirms or denies his account. The story exists in the conversation and nowhere else. The mystery is the depth of the forest. The hunter has spent his life in it, and he has seen things he cannot fully explain. The implication is that the forest is large enough to contain things that have not been cataloged, that the species lists in the Pokédex are incomplete, and that the world the player has been exploring is partial. The complete catalog may not exist. The species may not all be known to anyone. This is a gentler version of the same theme that runs through many of the larger mysteries. The world is bigger than the maps. The catalog is shorter than the territory. The careful traveler can find evidence of things the official records do not include. The hunter's story is one small example of this, delivered by an old man at the edge of a forest, told once and then left to drift away. In one of the small port cities of the Hoenn region, near a dock where ships come and go, there is a sailor sitting on a barrel who tells stories to anyone who will listen. The stories are mostly about voyages he has taken to places that the player cannot visit. He describes islands that are not on the regional map. He describes coastlines that no one else in the city seems to recognize. He describes weather patterns and currents that do not match the standard descriptions in the books. The sailor is friendly, slightly drunk, and willing to talk for as long as anyone will engage with him. His stories are full of small details that suggest he has actually been to the places he describes, and his accuracy on the details he can verify makes the parts that cannot be verified feel more plausible. He is not an obvious liar. He may simply have traveled further than anyone else in the city to places no one else has chosen to visit. The mystery is whether the places he describes are real. The series does not confirm them. The player cannot sail to them. The maps do not include them. But the sailor continues to describe them, and the consistency of his accounts across multiple visits suggests that he is not simply inventing them. If he is inventing, he is doing so with unusual care. This is the kind of detail the series uses to suggest the vastness of the world without showing it directly. The sailor is one voice. The places he describes are one set of suggestions. Other characters in other cities sometimes mention similar places, and the references begin to overlap, and a picture begins to form of a world with many more islands and coastlines than any single game has ever drawn. The sailor continues to sit on his barrel. The ships continue to come and go. The player can come back to him on multiple visits, and he will tell the same stories with small variations, and the stories will continue to suggest that the world contains far more than the maps have included. The mystery is not whether he is right. The mystery is the size of the territory he is pointing toward. As we drift toward the quiet end of this long walk through the mysteries of the Pokémon world, it is worth pausing for a few moments to let the pace slow further, to settle into the rhythm of what we have already covered, and to allow the smaller details to surface in memory before the conversation closes. We have walked through towers and forests, through caves and shrines, through underwater chambers and quiet small towns. We have met ghosts, gardeners of dreams, kings without kingdoms, and small fishermen who have noticed the slow changes of the sea. What unites all of these places is a particular quality of trust that the games extend to their players. The mysteries are not insisted upon. They are placed quietly in the world and left for the curious to notice. A player who rushes through the main story will encounter very few of them, and a player who pauses, who reads the small descriptions, who walks into the optional rooms, will encounter many. The games do not punish the rusher. They simply reserve the deeper experience for those who choose to slow down. This is part of why the mysteries have endured across decades of play. They are not central. They are not necessary. They are not advertised on the boxes or featured in the trailers. They sit in the corners of the world waiting, and they have been waiting since the games first appeared. Players who discover them often feel a small private joy at having found something the wider audience may not have noticed. The mysteries reward attention, and attention is the rarest currency in a fast-moving world. The deeper pattern across all of these mysteries is one of incomplete knowledge. The Pokémon world is presented to the player as a place where many things are known, but where many other things are not known, and where the gap between the two is honestly acknowledged. The characters do not pretend to understand the legends they recite. The researchers do not pretend to have explained the phenomena they study. The travelers do not pretend to have mapped every corner of the territory they cross. This kind of epistemic honesty is unusual in adventure games, which often present their worlds as fully knowable by the end of the story. The Pokémon games take a different approach. The world is partly knowable, partly not, and the not knowable parts are not failures of the game, but features of it. The mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, and the player is meant to accept that some questions will never be answered. There is a gentle wisdom in this approach. Most of life, in the actual world we live in, is also like this. We do not understand everything. We never will. The act of living is partly the act of becoming comfortable with the gaps in our understanding, of finding peace with the things we cannot solve, of continuing to walk forward into territory that remains, in many small ways, unfamiliar. The Pokémon games quietly model this, and the modeling is part of why so many players find the games comforting. The towers and the caves and the small ghost children are not horror elements. They are quiet acknowledgments that the world has weight and history and consequences that the player will not always understand. The recognition is gentle, the presentation is soft, and the player is invited to feel the weight without being asked to solve it. The mysteries are not problems. The mysteries are presences, and the presences are part of why the world feels real. When players reflect on their favorite Pokémon experiences, the mysteries often appear high on the list. The Cubone story, the Lavender Town atmosphere, the strange house in the forest, the voice in the city, the waiting child on the route. These moments are remembered not because they were entertaining. in the standard sense, but because they touch something quieter and deeper than entertainment usually reaches. They were emotional in a way that does not have a name. The series has continued to include these moments across many generations of games. Each new region brings its own small unsolved corners. Each new adventure leaves its own unanswered questions. The accumulation across decades has produced a body of quiet lore that no single player has experienced completely, and that no single text has documented fully. The lore lives in the games and in the players together, distributed across many memories and many conversations. This distributed quality is one of the most beautiful features of the Pokémon mysteries. They are not owned by any single person or any single text. They are shared. They are discussed in small forums and quiet rooms and late-night conversations between friends. They are passed from player to player, generation to generation, in the same way that real folklore is passed in real cultures. The mysteries have become a kind of community knowledge, and the community continues to grow. What ultimately makes the lost Pokémon and the unanswered questions feel so important is not their individual content, but their collective presence. The world contains them. The world has always contained them. The world will continue to contain them. The lore of the Pokémon series is built not just from what the games show explicitly, but from the quiet shadow of everything they leave half said and half shown. Every time a new game is released, a new set of small mysteries is added to the pool. A new town with a strange building, a new route with a quiet character, a new cave with an unexplained chamber. The pool grows, the questions accumulate, and the world becomes deeper with each addition. The depth is not measured in maps or in encounter rates or in stat distributions. The depth is measured in the small spaces where the games choose not to explain. This choice not to explain is a creative choice. It is not laziness or oversight. It is a deliberate decision to give the world room to breathe, to allow it to feel larger than the script, to make space for the player's imagination to do its work. The most beloved fantasy worlds in any medium tend to share this quality. The unsaid parts are as important as the said parts. The shadows are as important as the lights. In the Pokémon games, the shadows are particularly gentle. They are not threatening. They are not designed to frighten. They are designed to deepen, to give the world a quiet weight that the player can carry without distress. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town is not a horror dungeon. It is a graveyard, and graveyards are quiet places where people go to remember. The old chateau in the Eterna Forest is not a haunted house. It is an old house, and old houses have memories. The difference between gentle weight and active fear is the difference between a thoughtful world and a frightening one. The Pokémon series has consistently chosen the thoughtful world. The mysteries are placed with care. The dark elements are softened with light. The ghosts are not monsters, but small fragments of past lives, and the player encounters them not as enemies, but as quiet presences that share the world. The choice to handle these elements gently is part of what makes the games appropriate for players of any age, and part of what makes them resonate with players who return to them many years later. The return is part of the pattern. Players who first played the games as children often come back to them as adults, and the mysteries land differently with each return. A small story that seemed strange at age 10 might feel deeply sad at age 30. The Cubone and the Marowak Ghost are simple to read at one age and complicated at another. The waiting child on the route is a curiosity for a young player and a quiet sorrow for an older one. The games stay the same, and the players change, and the mysteries grow with them. This long lifespan of meaning is one of the rarest qualities in any kind of art. Most stories work at a single level for a single audience. The best stories, the ones that endure across generations, work at multiple levels and grow with their readers. The mysteries of the Pokemon games belong to this rare category. They are simple enough to be enjoyed by a child and deep enough to reward a lifetime of reflection. The lost Pokemon and the unanswered questions and the small quiet sights are part of the same continuous fabric. They are the texture of the world. They are the reason the regions feel like places rather than maps. They are the reason returning to a game years later can feel like returning to a town you once visited rather than reloading a save file. The texture is not accidental. The texture is the result of many small, careful choices made by many different designers across many years of work. This long, quiet walk through these mysteries has not solved them. It was never meant to. The walk was meant to acknowledge them, to give them space to breathe in the player's awareness, to let them settle gently into the kind of memory that survives long after individual game sessions have ended. The towers and the caves and the small forgotten characters do not need to be solved. They need to be remembered, and the remembering is what keeps them alive. Pokémon as a series has lasted nearly 30 years now. It has changed enormously across those years. The graphics have advanced, the mechanics have expanded, the rosters have grown, the technical capabilities have moved from small handheld screens to large console displays to mobile devices and back again. But the quiet quality of the world, the willingness to leave things half explained, the trust placed in the player's imagination has remained consistent across all of those changes. The series knows what it is, and it has stayed true to that knowing. The towers will continue to stand. The caves will continue to wait. The small ghosts will continue to drift through the corners of the rooms they have always occupied. The fishermen and the artists and the old hunters will continue to tell their slow stories to whoever happens to walk by. The pillars at the tops of the mountains will continue to mark the places where the world was first arranged, and the modern towns at the bottoms of those mountains will continue to live their daily lives without remembering what is above them. This is what a living world looks like. Not everything is explained. Not everything is connected. Not everything resolves. The world contains more than any single perspective can hold, and the perspectives we have are partial, and the partiality is part of what makes the world feel real. The Pokémon games have understood this from the beginning, and they have continued to understand it across every generation, and the understanding is one of the deepest reasons the series has remained what it is. For players drifting towards sleep with these stories echoing in their minds, the comfort is in the continuity. The towers will still be there tomorrow. The caves will still be waiting. The small ghost children in the corners of the old houses will still be standing where they always stood. The world does not change when the player closes the game. The world continues in some quiet sense, regardless of whether the player is watching, and the next visit will find the same small rooms still holding the same small, unfinished stories. The unfinished quality is not a problem. The unfinished quality is the point. A finished story is closed. An unfinished story is open. An open story can be returned to, can grow with the returner, can mean different things at different times in life. The Pokémon mysteries are open stories, and their openness is their gift, and the gift is part of what has kept the series in the hearts of players for so many years. There is something quietly remarkable about a children's adventure series that has chosen, repeatedly and consistently, to include these small open spaces in its worlds. Most children's media closes its stories. Most children's media resolves its mysteries. The Pokémon games have done something different. They have trusted children and the adults those children would become with the experience of unresolved depth. The trust has been rewarded with decades of devotion. When players think back to the games they love most, they often think of these small, open moments. The ghost on the middle floor, the voice in the city, the standing stones on the hillside, the child who waits at the edge of the route. These moments do not appear in the marketing. They do not appear in the strategy guides. They appear only in the games themselves, available only to the players who slow down enough to encounter them. The slowing down is its own reward. The same player who rushes through the main story will see different things than the player who lingers in the small rooms. Neither approach is wrong. The games support both. But the lingering player will carry into their later years a collection of small images that the rushing player will never have collected. The images are quiet, and they are personal, and they are the kind of memory that lasts. The mysteries we have walked through together tonight are not all of the mysteries in the series. There are many more, scattered across regions and generations, and there will be more in every future game. The complete catalog will never be assembled. The complete catalog is not the point. The point is the walking and the noticing and the gentle settling of the questions into the kind of awareness that does not need to resolve them in order to be at peace. In the very small hours of the night, when the rest of the world has grown quiet and the only sounds are the small sounds of breathing and the small sounds of distant air, these mysteries can settle in a way they cannot during the noisy hours of the day. The towers feel a little closer in the dark. The caves feel a little nearer. The old characters in the small rooms feel a little more present. The quiet of the late night is the natural medium of these stories, and the natural reader is the listener who is almost ready to sleep. The lost Pokémon in the half-told stories will continue to wait, the way they have always waited, for the next listener who pauses long enough to hear them. They do not need to be solved tonight. They do not need to be explained. They simply need to be acknowledged, and the acknowledgement is enough, and the acknowledgement is what we have done across this long, quiet walk together. The towers will still be standing in the morning. The caves will still be open. The small ghost children will still be in their corners. The kingdoms that fell will still be remembered in their shrines. The pillars at the tops of the mountains will still mark the places where the world was first arranged. The world will continue, and the player will continue, and the small mysteries will continue, and the continuing is the gift. Thank you for walking through these quiet places tonight. If anything here has settled gently into your evening, you are welcome to come back and walk through them again, at whatever pace you choose, on whatever night feels right. The towers and the caves and the small forgotten characters will be here whenever you return. They do not go anywhere. They simply wait, the way they have always waited for the next slow listener who has time to spend with them. Rest well, wherever you are, and let the small mysteries settle into your sleep without rushing to resolve themselves. They are old enough to wait and gentle enough to keep, and they will still be here in the morning when you wake. Another video will continue softly to the left of your screen if you wish to drift further. Let it play or let it not. Either way, the world we have walked through tonight will continue quietly, the way it always does, in the small corners where the answers were never quite written down.